In the land of pyramids, punishment was an art. A stolen amulet could cost you a hand. A careless word could get your tongue nailed to a temple wall. Step out of line in ancient Egypt and you wouldn't just die. You'd be rewritten, erased from stone, forgotten by your own gods, swallowed by the desert. This was a civilization that built eternity and weaponized it. From public floggings in the shadow of the Sphinx, to mummified traitors left to rot in cursed tombs, to priests who turned curses into law, this isn't the Egypt they teach in school. This is the side of history chiseled out of textbooks. The most brutal, the most creative, the most terrifying punishments in the ancient world. And you thought the afterlife was the scary part. Before we descend into the guts of ancient justice, quick question: where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far across time zones this story travels. And if you're into history that cuts deep literally, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We dig up the darkest corners of the past every week, and trust me, this is just the beginning. Impalement. It began with a whisper, a crime in the dark, a betrayal behind palace walls, or perhaps a theft from the wrong tomb, and it ended with a pole. Impalement wasn't just execution, it was a message. A violent vertical exclamation point hammered into the sand. When ancient Egypt chose this method, it wasn't simply trying to eliminate a criminal. It was broadcasting horror. The condemned stood more often, knelt before a tall, sharpened stake, sometimes greased to ease entry, sometimes left dry for maximum tearing. The point was inserted slowly, often rectally or vaginally, and gravity did the rest. There were no ropes, no pulley system, just the body and the stake. As the weight pulled downward, the wood pushed upward, parting muscle, splitting organs, sometimes emerging through the shoulder or mouth. This wasn't immediate. Victims could live for hours, even a day, impaled and twitching. Crows came first, then dogs, then silence. But impalement in ancient Egypt wasn't an everyday spectacle. It was saved for the grandest betrayals acts that the gods themselves would have choked on. Like adultery against royalty, treason during wartime, or defiling a sacred tomb. In those moments, the punishment had to match the offense. It had to echo into the afterlife. Which brings us to a core feature of Egyptian justice: performance. This was a civilization that believed the soul was judged not just on deeds, but on visibility. What you did in life mattered, but how publicly you suffered for it, that mattered too. So they built execution sites along busy roads or near temple entrances. The stake rose like a black reed from the desert floor, each one a mute accusation. Merchants passed by. Children whispered. Priests gave it a glance mid-chant. You could not ignore impalement. That was the point. And it wasn't always a solo show. There were records sparse, fragmentary, deliberately burned of mass impalements. Conspirators lined up. A single crime, spidering out through dozens of bodies. The harem conspiracy of Ramesses III in 1155 BCE is a rare peek into the machinery of royal justice. His own wives and court officials plotted against him. When the dust settled, some were forced to commit suicide. Others, well, the silence in the scrolls screams volumes. Archaeologists have speculated the rest. Wooden stakes, royal decree, and a line of bodies making the Nile itself recoil. Visualize it. The golden sun of Egypt beating down, flies humming in clouds, and in the distance, dozens of wooden stakes catching the light like twisted halos. Each one bearing a man who dared offend the divine order. But this wasn't just punishment. It was deterrence weaponized. The Egyptians believed in Ma'at, cosmic order, balance, truth. When someone shattered that, the entire world risked spinning off its axis. Impalement was the pharaoh's way of slamming his boot down and screaming, "Not today." There's a dark irony here. For a civilization obsessed with the afterlife, This punishment also ensured spiritual sabotage. You see, to reach the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, the body had to be whole. That's why mummification was sacred. But impalement? It shredded the vessel. It guaranteed that when the soul stood before Osiris, it did so with its insides outside and its integrity in question. Execution as spiritual annihilation. It gets worse. In certain cases, the stake was hammered, not through the rear, but directly through the chest, pinning the heart in place like a bug in a display case. This wasn't just execution. This was experimentation in terror, and while the heart was traditionally weighed against a feather to judge purity, these impalements made a different point, that the accused's heart was no longer needed. Judgment had already been passed by Pharaoh himself. But how did they justify such horror? Easy, with order. In a land where the flooding of the Nile was a divine calendar, any disruption to social harmony had to be met with symmetrical violence. You broke the rules broke you. Still, impalement wasn't always predictable. Sometimes it was political. A rival removed not with quiet poison, but with public humiliation. Because while poison left whispers, stakes left scars on the collective memory. And here's where the cruelty turned cinematic. There are tales likely embroidered by later writers of the condemned, being forced to watch the sharpening of their own stake, of families being made to observe, of singers and dancers performing nearby, a perverse mockery of the solemnity of death, even accounts of priests blessing the stake beforehand, as if to say, yes, the gods approve this horror. Over time, as dynasties rose and fell, impalement flickered in and out of fashion, but the memory of it stayed. Long after the last body was dragged down and burned, the fear remained etched into the sand. It became a cautionary tale, a whispered phrase, "Don't end up on the stake." Parents told it to their children, scribes encoded warnings in scrolls. Even tomb walls, usually reserved for hymns and afterlife maps, sometimes bore tiny glyphs hinting at the horrors that waited for traitors. And all of this leads to one brutal truth. Ancient Egypt didn't need impalement often, but when it did, it made it count. Which begs the question, what other horrors waited for those who stepped out of line? If impalement was just the beginning, what did they do to the ones they really hated? Let's go deeper. Let's burn. Burning alive. Flames speak a language older than words. In ancient Egypt, they didn't just consume, they judged. Fire was more than destruction. It was obliteration, not just of flesh but of spirit. And when burning was chosen as a punishment, it wasn't to correct behavior, it was to erase identity. It was rare. That's the first thing to understand. Unlike Rome, which practically industrialized burning as a form of execution, Egypt reserved it, hoarded it like a secret, which made it all the more terrifying. You see, to an Egyptian, fire was unnatural. The body was sacred. It was a vessel, carefully prepared in death, sealed in oils, wrapped in linens, and preserved to last eternity. Fire undid all of that. Instantly, it was chaos incarnate. So when someone was sentenced to be burned alive, it meant the crime hadn't just broken laws, it had broken the world. This punishment was for the truly unforgivable sacrilege, treason, or defilement of the dead. These weren't ordinary criminals, they were people whose very existence was seen as rot in the system. And rot, as every priest knew, must be purged by flame. Execution didn't happen in isolation. It was public, intentional, a spectacle designed to scar the city's memory. Picture this. The criminal dragged through dust, choked streets, hands bound, chants rising from the crowd like smoke. They reached the pyrea wooden altar of dry reeds, sticks, and oils stacked high like the bones of a forgotten god. Sometimes the pyre was pre-lit, sometimes it was ignited at their feet. Always, it was slow. Clothes burned first, curling into greasy black ribbons. then skin peeling and bubbling, eyelids fused, tongue cooked into silence, screams thickened in the throat. And through it all, the priests watched, cold, deliberate, as if to say, "This is not punishment, this is purification." But burning didn't just destroy the body, it destroyed the soul's chance at resurrection. That was the real horror. The Egyptian afterlife was conditional. It required preparation, mummification, ritual, spells, organs in jars, heart weighed against a feather. Fire short-circuited all of that. It denied the soul the right to journey, to stand before Osiris, to enter the field of reeds. To burn alive in Egypt was to vanish in every dimension: physical, spiritual, historical. And yet, even fire had hierarchy. Not everyone burned equally. There are records again, thin, hesitant-off class-based variations. A noble convicted of heresy might be burned in private, with oils and incense, as a perverse courtesy. A peasant who stole from a temple, dumped onto a crude pyre in the city square. And the worst? Tomb robbers. Ah, yes, tomb robbing. You'd think it was just about gold, but to the Egyptians, it was sacrilege in its purest form. Disturbing the dead was disturbing the gods, and fire was the only punishment considered thorough enough. Tomb robbers weren't just killed, they were erased, burned along with the stolen goods, their ashes scattered, their names struck from records. And names mattered. To erase a name was to condemn a soul to eternal wandering. Combine that with burning, and you didn't just kill a person, you turned them into a ghost that could never rest. Sometimes, burning was paired with curses. Priests would chant spells of annihilation while the flames rose. These weren't blessings, they were anti-prayers designed to block any possibility of redemption. The smoke wasn't just carbon, it was a spiritual firewall. And then there were the cases that defy belief. The legends. Whispers of priests turned heretics, of a royal concubine accused of poisoning Pharaoh, of entire households tied to wooden beams and set alight together, their screams echoing off temple walls. We don't know how much of this is true, but the Egyptians believed it. And belief, in a culture built on myth, is indistinguishable from reality. Here's one for the fire. A high priest of Ptah, caught selling burial secrets to foreigners. When exposed, he didn't deny it. Instead, he laughed, claimed the gods were deaf. So they tied him to the statue of Ptah himself and lit the chamber. Stone cracked in the heat. The statue melted. And when the fire died, they left the ruins as a warning. Gods burned too. But of course, not all burnings were so theatrical. Some were quiet, political, hidden behind palace doors, a threat more than an act. Confess, or the fire waits. Sometimes that was all it took. The fear was universal. Fire didn't care if you were a slave or a priest. It ate you the same way. And it's worth remembering, Egyptians didn't burn their dead. They buried. They embalmed. Fire was for the unworthy, for those who had broken the sacred covenant of balance. To be burned alive wasn't just punishment. It was proof that you no longer belonged to the world, that you were, in fact, its enemy. This wasn't a civilization that executed lightly, but when it did, and chose fire, it did so with terrifying precision. And there's a final, cruel irony. In later centuries, as Egypt fell under foreign rule, fire became more common. Greek and Roman authorities brought their own justice. Burnings increased. But by then, the meaning had changed. It was just death. In the old days, it had been annihilation. So when the ancient texts whisper of fire, listen closely. It isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. From person to flame to nothing. And if burning alive was the punishment for crimes against the gods, what did they do for crimes against Pharaoh? Let's get ready to drown. Drowning. Water was life in ancient Egypt. The Nile was sacred, a ribbon of green splitting the desert in two, feeding crops, carrying boats, whispering prayers between reeds. But water could also kill, and when it did, it was cold, silent, and final. Drowning as punishment wasn't always about theatrics. It didn't need stakes or fire or crowds. It just needed a river, or a well, or a deep, forgotten pool. But don't let the simplicity fool you. This was psychological warfare wrapped in ritual. Because in a civilization built on order, drowning was chaos incarnate. It was an unmarked grave in motion. The condemned didn't get the honor of fire or the scars of blades. They just vanished beneath the surface. No funeral rites, no embalmment, no passage to the afterlife, just water and silence and nothing. And that's exactly what made it terrifying. The crimes that warranted drowning were specific, intimate. Adultery, especially among women. Infidelity was seen not just as personal betrayal but as cosmic contamination, a disruption of the divine balance of all things. To correct that imbalance, the offender was drowned, not publicly executed, not flogged, submerged. Women, especially, were targeted with this punishment. If a noblewoman betrayed her husband, especially a royal, the state treated it as blasphemy, and blasphemy required the erasure of the offender's soul. Water was a paradox in Egyptian spirituality. The Nile was sacred, yes, but unclean water, uncontrolled water, was feared. The chaotic flood, the swamp, the deep. These were places where monsters lived, where gods drowned in myths, where order lost its grip. Drowning someone in the Nile was like handing them over to the forces of disorder itself. And make no mistake, it wasn't always the Nile. In some accounts, condemned individuals were drowned in sacred lakes near temples. Why? Because they couldn't be buried on holy ground, but they could be disposed of in it. It was as if the temple was saying, "You don't deserve the desert, you don't deserve the crypt, you deserve the void." Execution by drowning wasn't flashy. That was the point. It left no wounds, no scars, no ashes, just ripples. You could drag someone out of their home at night, bind their limbs, and drop them into a canal. By morning, all that remained was a silence that nobody questioned. And if the body floated up days later, it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. The rituals had been skipped. The soul was lost. The body, bloated and fish-eaten, was just a ghost's echo. There were more ritualistic forms too. Some condemned were placed into sealed baskets or sack-sweat coffin sand lowered into the water. This wasn't just execution, it was symbolic burial. The bag replaced the tomb, the river replaced the desert. And when the sack disappeared beneath the current, it was a final denial of the body's sanctity. Even the act of drowning had variations. There are whispers, half facts in scrolls and tomb graffiti about ceremonies where the condemned were made to confess before being walked into the water, step by step until their head vanished beneath the surface. Priests watching, chanting spells not for salvation, but for containment. They weren't guiding the soul into the afterlife. They were sealing it away. And then there's the worst version, forced drowning. It was said that some executions involved not just water, but choice. The condemned would be tied and thrown into the Nile with the possibility of escape. The knots weren't always perfect. Sometimes the sack wasn't weighted. If the condemned managed to break free, swim ashore, and survive, some towns considered it a sign from the gods. But most drowned. Because this wasn't a test, it was a trap. Even if they did escape the water, they were still marked, a drowned soul in a breathing body, ostracized, hunted, banished, sometimes recaptured and executed again, this time more traditionally by fire or blade. And yet, the ritual stuck. Why? Because drowning did more than kill. It deleted, It bypassed the bureaucracy of the afterlife. No mummification, no heart weighing, just a life extinguished by a silence that never ends. There's an apocryphal story, half legend, half curse-off, a temple scribe who seduced a priestess. When their affair was discovered, he wasn't executed outright. Instead, he was told to walk into the sacred pool of Sobek, the crocodile god. If he survived, he would be forgiven. He took 3 steps. He didn't take a 4th. Whether the water killed him or the crocodile did doesn't matter. What matters is that no one spoke his name again. Not in records, not in whispers, not even in curses. He drowned in more than water. He drowned in forgetting. And that's the theme. Drowning in ancient Egypt wasn't just about removing someone. It was about denying them memory. Family members weren't allowed to grieve. No tombs were erected. No names were written. Even in the Book of the Dead, drowning is described as a fate worse than death. You don't get to be judged by Osiris. You don't get to defend your heart. You're just gone. It's a hauntingly modern idea, canceling someone spiritually. And if drowning could do that to your soul, imagine what punishments they reserved for crimes like blasphemy or royal defection. Crimes that didn't just disrupt order, but spit in its face. We've touched fire. We've tasted water. Let's see what happens when they take your body apart, piece by piece. Mutilation. There's a peculiar kind of cruelty and punishment that doesn't kill, that lets the body live, but only as a shadow of what it once was. Mutilation in ancient Egypt wasn't about execution. It was about editing a person, taking a human being and whittling them down to a cautionary tale. It started with parts. Noses, ears, tongues, hands, genitals. Each carried symbolic weight, each sent a message, and each was chosen not just for utility, but for poetry. Because mutilation was, in its essence, storytelling through disfigurement. Cut off a thief's hand, you've erased the tool of his crime. Remove the tongue of a liar, you've silenced the offense itself. Carve the nose from an adulterer, you've marked the face with shame. This wasn't random violence. It was curated, purposeful, a ritual of precision. In ancient Egyptian society, the body wasn't just a physical shell, it was a divine blueprint. Every part had a role in both life and the afterlife. To mutilate someone was to spiritually vandalize them. A broken body meant a broken soul. Let's start with the nose. The nose cut was infamous. It was usually reserved for crimes of betrayal, adultery, disloyalty, deceit. In royal circles, it was almost routine. A concubine caught with a guard cut her nose. A courtier who gossiped about the pharaoh cut his nose. Why the nose? Because it was visible, permanent, public. You couldn't hide it with clothes or healing. A missing nose turned a person into walking propaganda. Here walks disloyalty, it said. Here walks shame. There's evidence, both archaeological and textual, that entire groups were punished this way. Armies that mutinied, harem conspirators, disgraced officials. One Middle Kingdom papyrus mentions a parade of noseless men through the city square, their wounds stuffed with linen to keep the flies out. Imagine it, a silent column of faces, each one mutilated identically, marching under the desert sun. Then there were the ears. Ear cutting was both a warning and a sentence. Offenders might have one ear removed for a first offense, say, gossiping in the temple, spreading heresy, or mocking a priest. A second offense? Both ears. This wasn't just to mark, it was to remove listening. In a society where divine word was sacred, those who misused or misunderstood the word of the gods had no right to hear anymore. Some had their ears branded instead. Others had molten resin poured into the canal to deafen them. You heard wrong once? Now you'll hear nothing. The hands, those were for thieves. Stealing wasn't just a crime, it was a spiritual imbalance. Thefts from tombs or temples could disrupt entire cosmic cycles. Hands caught in the act were sometimes severed on the spot. Scribes recorded incidents of thieves being bound, their arms stretched over altars, and their thieving hands hacked off with ceremonial knives. But not always cleanly. Executioners weren't surgeons. Bones shattered, tendons tore, victims bled out more often than not. If they survived, they lived as symbols. One-handed, broken, begging outside temples as a warning to others. Tongues were another favorite. Egyptians held speech sacred. Words were spells, incantations, lies, blasphemies, or treasonous talk were treated as corruption at the root. To silence a criminal permanently, their tongue was cut out. Not at the base, but further in-sliced from the throat, leaving them mute, blood-choked, and gasping. Some accounts describe hot knives used to cauterize the wound mid-cut, turning the mouth into a sealed, scarred void. This punishment had religious weight. Without a tongue, the condemned couldn't speak their name in death, couldn't recite the spells required to navigate the underworld, couldn't declare their innocence to Osiris. A tongueless soul was a silenced soul. Then there's the horror of genital mutilation. This was rare, but not myth. Used primarily for Schul Krimser, P, incest, or violations of temple virgins. The offender might be castrated, sometimes partially, sometimes fully. It was considered a purification, removing the offending desire at its root. But also a warning. Desire was dangerous, and the gods were watching. Mutilation extended to branding as well. Hot irons pressed against the skin, forehead, arm, chest, burned symbols declaring guilt, thief, traitor, blasphemer. These weren't tattoos. They were scars that screamed across generations. A branded man couldn't escape his past. Even in death, the gods would see the mark and judge accordingly. And then we reach the darkest variation, ritual dismemberment. This wasn't punishment for ordinary crime. This was reserved for enemies of the state, rebels, usurpers, those who tried to topple Pharaoh himself. Captured alive, they were taken to temples not for forgiveness, but for demonstration. Priests performed the mutilations. Not executioners, not soldiers, priests. Each cut symbolic, each limb removed with a chant. They called it unmaking, deconstructing the person, reversing their existence, one part at a time. There's a legend half true, half wishful of an advisor who betrayed his pharaoh during a famine. When discovered, he was not killed outright. Instead, he was brought to a public altar and reduced. First his tongue, then his hands, then his eyes. Finally, they removed his heart, embalmed it, and sealed it in a jar labeled false one. His body was left as a puzzle of parts. His soul, presumably lost in the noise. This wasn't just punishment. It was art, political theater, divine choreography. And it worked. Mutilation left messages that lasted. They didn't need to be written. They were worn, displayed, passed down. Parents pointed at beggars missing noses and told their children, "That's what happens when you lie." Lovers saw scarred lips and remembered, "Faithfulness matters." Priests saw tongueless corpses and warned, "The gods are always listening." But here's the ultimate twist. Mutilation didn't always come from the state. Sometimes, families requested it. A father dishonored by a son might ask the court to brand him. A betrayed husband could seek his wife's nose. It wasn't just about justice, it was about control, ownership of punishment. A world where even your own blood could turn the knife. Because in Egypt, the body was both weapon and battlefield. And if mutilation was how they left you alive, imagine what they did when they wanted to keep you alive, but break everything else. Let's hear the lashes. It's time for whipping. Whipping. The lash sings. Not like music, not like poetry, but like fire quick, sharp, unforgettable. In ancient Egypt, whipping was the metronome of punishment, a rhythm of power, pain, and control. It didn't kill. That wasn't the point. It reminded. Whipping wasn't the most extreme punishment, but it was the most common. It filled the space between warning and mutilation, between fine and execution. It was the heartbeat of state discipline. And that's what made it dangerous. Because it was everywhere. From city squares to temple courtyards, from the Nile's edge to the dark belly of grain storehouses, the whip cracked. It echoed down marble halls and through open-air markets. Slaves, thieves, tax dodgers, even scribes who falsified a number. They all felt it. And there was a terrifying logic behind it. The Egyptians didn't whip just to cause pain. They whipped to organize pain. Every strike had a number. Every number had a law. There were scroll-stattered, brittle things that assigned exact lashes to specific offenses. Steal a loaf of bread? 5 lashes. Lie in court? 10. Insult a priest? 25, and a public apology. The lash was a unit of measurement, of morality, of social calibration. It wasn't just a tool, it was a language. And the dialect changed depending on who you were. Slaves received the most. Their skin was seen as state property and thus subject to state correction. A lazy laborer? Lashed. A runaway? Lashed more. A thief? Lashed, then branded. The whip wasn't just punishment, it was punctuation. A way of saying, you belong to someone, and that someone is angry. But even free men weren't safe. Egyptian courts handed out whipping sentences for debt, defiance, even drunkenness. And while higher classes might avoid the lash through bribes or favors, occasionally someone powerful got cracked open in public. And when that happened, it was theater. Picture a minor noble, stripped to the waist, tied to a column in the palace courtyard. A hush falls. The whip is soaked sometimes in water, sometimes in vinegar or brine. It strikes. Once. Twice. 10 times. Blood follows. Silence follows blood. The noble grits his teeth, but the crowd watches everything. Because this isn't just about pain. It's about balance. The pharaoh's court didn't believe in random cruelty. It believed in mathematical violence. The number of lashes reflected not just the crime, but the social equation surrounding it. Who was hurt? Who was embarrassed? How public the offense was. The whip settled scores. And the design of the whip itself? Brutal genius. Made from braided leather, often tipped with sharp bone or metal fragments. Not enough to kill, just enough to tear, to draw blood, to make the skin remember every second. The pain wasn't just acute, it was chronic. Victims carried the scars for life stripes across their back like tally marks. Each one an entry in a ledger of state justice. There were special executioners trained for the task. They weren't monsters. They were functionaries. They kept rhythm. They counted aloud. They ensured each lash was even, deliberate. They didn't aim to cripple unless told to. They aimed to warn. And here's the twist. Sometimes the condemned had to recite their crime with each strike. I lied to the scribe. Crack. I disrespected the priest. Crack. I stole from the temple. Crack. Each confession mingled with blood and sand. A spoken record etched into the air before the gods. And there were deeper rituals, darker echoes. Whipping sometimes happened at night, beneath temple vaults. No witnesses, just the condemned, the lash, and the sound of repentance. In these moments, pain wasn't just correction, it was purification. Because pain, in Egyptian metaphysics, had power. It could drive out evil, cleanse, redirect, A man punished physically might be spared further spiritual harm. The whip became a scalpel cutting out sin, one lash at a time. But not everyone believed in mercy. Some sentences reached into the hundreds. 100 lashes, 200, 500. Few survived that. Blood loss, infection, shock. Even if the court didn't order death, death often arrived anyway. Quiet, inevitable, a byproduct of numbers gone too far. And yet, people survived. They limped back into the world, their backs a roadmap of wrong choices. Some wore their scars with shame, others with pride. A few even joined the state, became lashers themselves. I took pain, they might say. Now I give it. And the whip? It never changed. It waited, coiled, hung on palace walls like a sleeping serpent, ready to sing again. Even the gods acknowledged it. Some temple rituals involved ceremonial lasha symbolic punishment for humanity's failures. Priests would strike idols of demons, or clay figures representing sin. The idea was clear. The lash keeps the world in line. And if the whip was for correction, what did they use when correction wasn't enough? When someone didn't just break the law but spit on it, laughed in its face, and dared it to respond? When pain had to go deeper than skin? Next comes something colder, heavier, less poetic. Let's talk about forced labor, where the punishment didn't end with the whip, it began there. Forced labor. There are prisons with walls, and there are prisons with shovels. Ancient Egypt preferred the latter. When a punishment had to be more than pain when it needed to be productive, the sentence was forced labor, not a brief stint, not a slap on the wrist with a pickaxe. This was punishment measured in years, sweat, and the erosion of identity. A slow execution by exhaustion. It began with shackles. Not metaphorical ones. Iron, bronze, or leather, fastened at the ankles, wrists, or neck. The condemned were marched out of cities in chains, eyes forward, backs still raw from the whip. Some were criminals, some debtors, others political dissidents. The worst were tomb robbers sent to dig out new graves after desecrating old ones. That's poetic justice, Egyptian style. Labor camps weren't hidden. They sprawled across the landscape like industrial scars, quarries, mines, construction sites. The most notorious, the turquoise mines of Sinai and the sandstone quarries of Gebel el Silsila. Endless heat, air so dry it could crack your teeth, days that didn't end, they just changed color. There were no rest days, no shade, no mercy. Shifts lasted from sunrise until the stars blinked on. Tasks included hauling blocks, carving tunnels, dragging sleds, building monuments for gods you'd never meet. If you were lucky, you survived long enough to see one project finished before being shoved into the next. If not, you became part of the foundation. Corpses were buried beneath stone, not for ritual, for convenience. And the overseers? Not quiet administrators. They were armed, aggressive, and often chosen for their lack of empathy. Their tools were whips, rods, and curses. Their job wasn't to guide work. It was to suppress rebellion, because forced labor camps were always on the verge of riot. But no one rioted. Not really. Because the camps didn't just break bodies, they broke minds. The diet was minimal. Barley bread, lentils, onions, and water thick with silt. Medical care didn't exist. Disease spread through the camps like whispers. Infections, parasites, sunstroke. Broken bones weren't set, they were ignored. If a man collapsed, he was dragged out of the way. If he didn't move, he was left. Even the language changed. Once you entered a labor camp, you weren't called by name. You were beast, thief, worm. The erasure wasn't accidental. It was systematic. Because Egypt wasn't just punishing your crime, it was rewriting your existence. And what's chilling is how efficient it all was. These weren't chaotic dungeons, they were well-run engines of suffering. Records were kept, labor logs, death tallies, supply manifests. The ancient Egyptian bureaucracy didn't flinch at forced labor, it documented it like taxes. Some camps had quotas: move this many stones, survive this many days, earn a sliver of food. Those who met quotas were rewarded with slightly less brutal conditions. Those who didn't, punished. Not with more work, but with worse work. One of the most infamous tasks: latrine duty in the temple pits. Imagine this wading through waste, barefoot, in heat that made the air shimmer, scraping filth with a reed scoop. You weren't just labor, you were decay management. There's evidence some laborers were also experimented on. Priests from healing temples occasionally used the injured or dying to test salves, amputations, even primitive surgical rituals. If you screamed, good, that meant it worked. And yet, for all its horror, forced labor wasn't always final. Some survived. A few were released after serving their sentence. Broken, yes. Scarred, absolutely, but alive. And when they returned to society, they were marked, not just physically, spiritually. Their names were listed in public records attached to their crimes and their years of forced labor. Future employers knew, priests knew, their own families knew. It was the punishment that never stopped. And if you died in the camps? No burial, no rites. Your body was tossed into mass pits or buried beneath unfinished walls. No name, no amulets, no path to the field of reeds. Your soul wandered. Because that's the ultimate truth of forced labor in Egypt. It was the punishment that pretended to spare you. It left you breathing, but took everything else. It made you productive until you broke. And what makes this punishment so brutal is not just what it was, it's what it built. Temples, monuments, pyramids, some of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. They shimmer in sunlight, they dazzle tourists, they're icons of human achievement. And underneath them, bones, suffering, thousands of lives crushed into the mortar of eternity. So next time someone marvels at the perfection of a sandstone obelisk, remember the hands that bled to carve it, the backs that bent until they cracked, the souls that were ground into sand. But there's one punishment worse still, worse than exhaustion, worse than whips. It's what happens when the gods decide your face is the problem. Let's cut deeper. Let's mutilate identity. Let's talk about amputation. Amputation. Imagine losing a piece of yourself not by accident, but by decree. Not in war, but in judgment. In ancient Egypt, amputation wasn't just punishment, it was punctuation. A grim full stop at the end of a crime. The state didn't simply want to mark the offender, it wanted to subtract from them. Permanently. It was brutal, it was symbolic, and it was horrifyingly effective. Amputation was punishment for crimes that, in the Egyptian worldview, demanded not just correction, but removal, theft, rebellion, assault on the sacred. The kind of offenses that left a spiritual scar too deep for words. So the state turned to the blade. Hand for a thief, foot for a deserter, fingers for a forger. It wasn't metaphor, it was literal justice. Let's start with the hand. Thieves were the most common recipients of this punishment. The logic was brutally poetic. You stole with your hand, you lose the hand. There's a certain symmetrical beauty in it if you're the one holding the knife. But the process wasn't clean. This wasn't surgical. No anesthesia, no antiseptic. Just a flat stone, a rusted blade, and a hammer. The hand bound at the wrist, stretched across the stone, was severed in one strike, or 3, or 5, depends on the executioner's mood and his aim. Screaming was expected. Blood loss was rampant. If you were lucky, a priest nearby might cauterize the stump with a hot iron. If not, infection took care of the rest, slowly, in stages. Some didn't make it, but if you did survive, your life was adjusted. You were a marked man, unable to work, unable to farm, begging, if you had the strength, pitied by no one. The missing limb wasn't just a wound, it was a signature. Everyone knew what you'd done. Even strangers could read your body like a scroll. Sometimes the punishment went further. Both hands, or a hand and a foot, especially in the case of repeat offenders. The state wasn't in the mood for second chances. You robbed once, maybe they'd let you keep your foot. You robbed again? Say goodbye to balance, to movement, to independence. There's a twisted genius in this. Amputation didn't just punish, it prevented. A man with no hands couldn't steal again. A man with no feet couldn't flee justice. The state eliminated the problem at the root. But it wasn't always that clean cut. In some cases, amputations were political. A rival noble found guilty of dishonorable actions, a phrase that could mean anything from seduction to sedition, might lose a finger as a warning, or a toe. Not enough to cripple, just enough to humiliate. There's a record vague, half-burned of a scribe who leaked military secrets. When caught, his tongue was removed, and then, just to make a point, so were his writing fingers. Poetry in punishment. And then, of course, there were false amputations. Yes, false. In rare cases, the state staged amputations, especially for foreign spies or traitors. They'd bind the accused, bring them to the square, swing the blade down, but strike beside the limb. A spectacle of mercy, or of deception. Because in Egypt, even punishment was sometimes theater. But most amputations? Dead serious. Sometimes even posthumous. That's right. There are records of corpses being mutilated after execution. Limbs removed, genitals severed, heads taken. Why? Because to enter the afterlife whole was sacred. To enter it mutilated was to curse the soul, to shame it in the next world. It was a statement. We hate you so much, we're punishing your ghost. It didn't stop at individuals. In times of war, Egyptian soldiers were ordered to collect the hands of slain enemies as proof of victory. There are entire murals ornate, grand, colorful, depicting heaps of severed hands stacked like offerings at Pharaoh's feet. It wasn't just cruelty, it was accounting. Hand by hand, the army measured its success. The enemy's dismemberment was both literal and administrative. War turned into math, death into documentation. And the message was clear. Egypt took hands seriously. So what about the public? How did they respond to amputation? With awe, with fear, with silence. Children were told stories about the man with no hands who lurked near the markets, stealing with his eyes. Merchants clutched their coin pouches tighter at the sight of a limping figure. Priests incorporated amputation into sermons, reminding the people that the gods watch not just deeds, but consequences. And sometimes rarely, but powerfully, the amputated were paraded. Not executed, not imprisoned, displayed, bound to posts in the city center, stumps wrapped in linen, signs hung from their necks. Thief, liar, desecrator. They didn't scream, they didn't beg. They just stood there, living warnings. And if you locked eyes with one, you'd see something worse than pain. You'd see absence, the missing part, the phantom limb, a void where justice had carved its name. And here's the darkest part. Some crimes weren't even that extreme. A hungry child caught stealing grain? Lose a finger. A desperate man who forged a tax record to feed his family? lose a hand. Mercy wasn't the system, balance was. This was a civilization that built its laws on the idea of divine symmetry. For every action, an equal reaction. For every theft, a subtraction. Amputation was the math of punishment. But if amputation was the punishment that left you less than whole, what happens when the state wants to take everything from your memory? When they don't just sever your limbs but your legacy? Next, we erase the face, the name, the story. Let's talk damnatio memoria, damnatio memoriae. In a world obsessed with eternity, the worst thing you could be was forgotten. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of remembrance. Names carved into stone, deeds etched in gold, faces immortalized in profile. Facing west, always west toward the setting sun, toward the afterlife. So when the state turned on you, when Pharaoh himself decided you no longer belonged in the story of Egypt, the punishment wasn't pain. It was erasure. Damnatio memorietha. Condemnation of memory wasn't a spectacle like whipping. It wasn't messy like mutilation. It was quiet, surgical, absolute. You weren't just killed, you were deleted. Scraped off temple walls. Your statues smashed, your tomb vandalized, your name, your sacred soul-binding name, chiseled out like a tumor. Because in Egyptian metaphysics, to exist was to be named. The soul, the Ba, the Ka, the Ren depended on recognition, on ritual, on memory. Erase the name, and you erase the soul. This wasn't metaphor, it was cosmic murder. The process was systematic. First, your monuments. Anything bearing your likeness was defaced, eyes gouged out, noses flattened, hands broken off. These weren't random acts of rage, they were precise. The eyes were portals to the soul. Destroy them, and the statue couldn't see into the afterlife. Break the hands? The figure could no longer offer or receive offerings. It was spiritually paralyzed. Then came the cartouches. The cartouche was the name-ringa divine loop encircling your hieroglyphic identity. Cutting it open was like opening a vein. Scribes were dispatched to temples, tombs, and scrolls to find every instance of your cartouche. They carved through stone, smeared ink, scraped paint. They hunted your name with a chisel. You became the unspoken. Pharaohs were not exempt. Akhenaten, the heretic king, who dared to overthrow Egypt's pantheon and worship only Aten, the sun disk, was perhaps the most famously erased. After his death, a coalition of priests and nobles waged war on his memory. His temples were dismantled. His name vanished from king lists. Even his mummified body, if ever found, remains unmarked. It's possible the state ensured no tomb would bear his name. No rite would guide him. No statue would remember. He lived for a decade. His memory died for centuries. That's the power of damnatio memoriae. And it wasn't limited to kings, queens, generals, priests, artists. Anyone who stepped too far out of line, religiously, politically, morally, could be targeted. One whispered accusation of heresy, one shift in power. Suddenly, your legacy became a liability, and the state moved fast. It wasn't just for punishment, it was for prevention. Erasing someone sent a message: we don't just kill our enemies, we annihilate them retroactively. And the implications were chilling. No afterlife. No prayers from descendants. No chance at redemption. Just oblivion. Even families could be punished this way. If a father committed treason, his children's names could be struck from lineage records. Entire bloodlines deleted. Their ancestral tombs defiled. Their sacred burial goods removed, sold, or melted down. Your blood didn't save you. Sometimes, it damned you. And it worked both ways. Some survivors fearing the same fate voluntarily altered their family histories, removed disgraced names, changed inscriptions. Some even destroyed their own heirlooms just to avoid association. In Egypt, memory was dangerous currency, and the punishment didn't need to be complete to be effective. Even partial erasure, just a face removed from one relief, just a name scratched off a tomb was enough to disrupt the spiritual GPS. Without a name, the soul wandered. Without a face, the gods couldn't recognize you. Without prayers, you faded. It was the slowest kind of death. And it infected everything. Imagine walking through the temple of Karnak, gigantic columns, endless hieroglyphs, and then you see a clean, deliberate absence, a name cut away, a blank space where history should be. That silence? That's power. It says, someone was here. Someone mattered. And now they don't. And the cruelty didn't end with stone. Even written records were purged. King lists were rewritten, scrolls copied with redacted names. Historians had to guess at who ruled when because the state had burned the originals. The erasure rippled forward in time, leaving historians and archaeologists to reconstruct ghosts. Even today, Egyptologists stumble upon these blanks and call them the lost ones. They had names once, lives, dreams. Now, just scars in the stone. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, damnatio memoriae didn't always work. Sometimes, erasure made the memory stronger. Akhenaten, erased from history, is now studied obsessively. His face once chipped off walls, now on museum posters. His name, once forbidden, is spoken around the world. The ultimate failure of the punishment? We remember the forgotten. But that doesn't make it any less brutal. Because, at the time, in the moment of deletion, the condemned didn't know they'd be remembered someday. All they knew was that their legacy was being dismantled, not just by enemies, but by bureaucrats, by men with chisels, by erasers. And if damnatio memoriae was the deletion of the soul, what happens when your punishment doesn't stop with your memory but follows you into death itself? When you're buried not in silence, but in fear? Let's go underground. Let's bury them alive. Burial alive. There's a specific kind of horror in being lowered into the earth while your heart still beats. Burial alive wasn't Egypt's first choice for punishment. It wasn't the go-to sentence like whipping or forced labor. It was something worse, reserved for the unthinkable, the unforgivable. It was a punishment used when the state didn't want you dead immediately. It wanted you forgotten slowly, layer by layer, breath by breath, as the sand turned into silence. This wasn't about execution. This was about transformation, from human to warning to myth. Those condemned to burial alive were treated differently from the moment of sentencing. Their crimes, typically of a spiritual or cosmic scale, were seen as contaminations, not just of law, but of the very order of the world. These were people who had betrayed Pharaoh, desecrated temples, committed incest, or defiled a sacred tomb. These were people who had broken the gods, and so the gods demanded a reply. A ritual, a reversal. Here's how it often happened. The condemned was paraded bound, blindfolded, cursed by priests, and spat on by crowds. No last rites, no offerings, no family present. They were escorted not to a prison, but to the edge of the necropolis, to a hole already dug. Not a deep grave, just deep enough. Sometimes it was a pit in the desert, sometimes a sealed chamber in an unfinished tomb. In rare cases, a bricked-up cell inside temple ruins. A space designed not to house the dead, but to trap the living. They were lowered inside. Not gently, sometimes naked, sometimes wrapped in burial linen as if mocking the funeral rituals they were being denied. The earth around them was cursed. Priests chanted spells not of protection, but of isolation, to seal the space, to confuse the soul, to prevent escape, not just of the body, but of the Kaith vital essence. And then they began to bury. Slowly. Not to be merciful, to be sure, to let the condemned feel every breath of air disappear, to give them time, not to reflect, to panic, to scream into dust. The mouth filled first, then the lungs. The silence wasn't immediate. It lingered, sometimes hours, sometimes days. No one checked, because the point wasn't just death. It was disintegration. Burial alive ensured that the condemned received none of the protections of the dead. No amulets, no charms, no jars to hold their organs, no book of the dead to guide their soul. Their tomb became a trap. And in Egyptian belief, this was catastrophic. A soul without a proper burial couldn't reach the field of reeds. It couldn't be judged. It couldn't be reborn. It wandered. It decayed. It became a mutt, a lost spirit curse to haunt the living, to scream in the wind, to rot forever in darkness. And if that soul managed to escape, if it rose, somehow, through cracks in the spiritual system, the priests had a backup plan. The site of burial was marked not with a tombstone, but with a curse. Glyphs warning future generations, do not dig, do not pray, do not remember. Burial alive was a multi-dimensional execution. It targeted the body, the soul, the memory, and the future. It made the person vanish 4 times. And sometimes, it was collective. Entire households punished this way. A royal concubine caught conspiring against Pharaoh, her children, servants, tutorsal buried alive with her, not because they were guilty, but because they were connected. The idea was to wipe out the line, to end the possibility of continuation. They'd be placed in a sealed room, bricked in from the outside. Candles lit, air growing thinner, time ticking slower. Eventually, one voice remained, then none. The bricks were blessed. The story, silenced. There's archaeological evidence, says Maul, chilling hints off such punishments. Bodies found in sealed chambers, twisted in final panic. No burial goods, no markers. Just dust and bone, and the unmistakable signature of slow death. And yet, in the cruelest irony, these were some of the most preserved bodies. The dry Egyptian climate kept their secrets intact, their faces frozen in the moment before suffocation, their hands clawed at stone, their mouths open, screaming forever. And the living learned the lesson. Burial alive wasn't just a punishment. It was a threat, a ghost story told to children, a warning whispered to servants, a nightmare behind the throne. It said, "We will not only end you, we will trap you in your ending." And if that's what happened to those the gods wanted erased, what happened to those who weren't just buried but fed to something? Something sacred, something reptilian, something with teeth? Let's meet the crocodiles. Let's talk execution by beast. Feeding to crocodiles. The Nile had gods. The Nile had monsters. Sometimes they were the same thing. In ancient Egypt, crocodiles were sacred and feared. Manifestations of Sobek, the crocodile-headed deity of strength, fertility, and protection. He was worshipped in temples, fed offerings, adorned in gold leaf. But Sobek didn't just bless. Sobek judged. And his judgments had teeth. Feeding criminals to crocodiles wasn't just punishment, it was ritual sacrifice, a fusion of law and religion, where death came with divine endorsement and snapping jaws. Let's start with the crocodile itself. To the Egyptians, it was a creature of duality. It could represent chaos, but also power. It was dangerous, but divine. And in punishment, this duality became weaponized. The process was as much performance as it was penalty. First, the condemned was selected for a crime that warranted divine attention, typically offenses that struck at the heart of the sacred order: blasphemy, temple theft, sacrilege, or, most dangerously, defiling the cult of Sobek himself. If you insulted the crocodile god, you didn't just get punished, you got offered. Not like a prisoner, like meat. The criminal was paraded, wrists bound, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes not. Priests led the way, scribes followed, inscribing the details of the crime. The crowd watched, not with pity, but reverence. This wasn't a spectacle, this was a sacrifice. The destination? A temple pool. Not just any body of water, but one filled with temple-raised crocodiles, animals hand-fed by priests, conditioned to associate humans with offerings. These weren't wild beasts. These were trained executioners. The condemned was brought to the edge. Sometimes they were thrown in immediately. Other times, there was ceremony. Priests chanted. Incense burned. The condemned might be forced to confess to Sobek, to the crowd, to the river. A final admission before the snapping. And then splash. The water churned. Crocodiles were patient, silent, then sudden. Sometimes it ended in seconds: a scream, a snap, silence. Other times, it took longer. The beasts played with their food, dragged it under, released it, bit again. Priests watched. They didn't intervene. This wasn't about mercy. It was about balance. Because if the crocodiles didn't kill the condemned, that meant something too. In some districts, survival was seen as divine pardon. The gods had refused the offering. The criminal, though mangled and bleeding, was dragged from the water, healed barely and banished. Spiritually cursed, but alive. Most weren't that lucky. Their bodies were rarely recovered, and that was part of the punishment. No burial, no embalming, no passage to the afterlife. The soul drowned, devoured, dispersed into the belly of a god. Sobek's judgment was final. And it didn't just end with criminals. In times of political upheaval, enemies of the state, rivals to Pharaoh, rebel leaders, even disgraced generals were condemned to the crocodile pits. Not because they broke laws, but because they broke faith. They challenged the divine order that Pharaoh upheld. Feeding them to Sobek wasn't just execution, it was theater. A reminder to all, you don't just answer to kings, you answer to gods. There's a legend, half buried in dust and time, of a temple acolyte who tried to poison the sacred crocodile at Kamombo. When caught, he was fed to that same crocodile in front of the entire priesthood. The god, they said, showed no hesitation. Another tale speaks of a noblewoman who seduced a temple priest during a fertility festival. She was stripped, bathed in milk and myrrh, and offered to the crocodiles at dawn. Not as punishment, as an apology. And the priest didn't just watch. They recorded. Scrolls exist fragmented, faded, detailing the number of bites, the time to death, the reaction of the crowd. These weren't just rituals. They were data, justice by spreadsheet, with teeth. Sobek's cult thrived on these sacrifices. They reinforced power, purified temples, created fear. And the people believed. Children were warned, disrespect the temple, and Sobek will eat your dreams. Servants whispered that the Nile rose faster after a sacrifice. Fishermen claimed crocodiles swam in ritual circles days after an execution. The divine had spoken, and it had a mouthful of human bone. But even Sobek had competition. Crocodile execution was dramatic, but in some cases, not efficient enough. What if the gods wanted certainty? What if a clean death wasn't enough? What if the body needed to be crushed? Not drowned, not eaten, crushed into silence. Let's talk stones. Let's talk pressure. Let's talk crushing. Crushing. No screams. Just the slow grind of inevitability. Crushing in ancient Egypt wasn't about speed. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about certainty. The most ancient kind of silence, the kind that came not from cutting, not from fire, not even from drowning, but from weight. Immovable, unbearable, sacred weight. Because when the pharaoh, the priests, or the gods themselves decided that someone needed not just to die, but to yield, they didn't raise a sword. They raised a stone. The punishment began with a sentence, not read aloud, whispered, scribbled in the margin of a trial. He will be crushed. No specifics, no timeline, just the destination, beneath something larger than you. There were methods. Sometimes it was direct boulders rolled onto the chest, the body pinned flat on a ceremonial platform, hands and legs spread like hieroglyphs of surrender. The rock didn't fall fast. It was lowered. Ropes pulled by men whose job wasn't to kill, but to obey. Inches at a time, until bones cracked, until lungs collapsed, until blood foamed at the mouth, and still the priests chanted. Because crushing wasn't just mechanical, it was ritual. The stone was a symbol, of Pharaoh, of divine order, of Ma'at itself. The belief was that a soul could not defy the gods if it was too broken to speak, too flat to fight. So they pressed it down. And down. Sometimes the stone wasn't lowered onto you. Sometimes you were lowered onto the stone. A large flat slab, baking in the desert sun. The condemned hoisted upbound, gagged and flailing, and dropped chest first onto the unyielding surface. Ribs split, organs ruptured. Blood pooled like spilled ink. The punishment didn't stop with one stone. In extreme cases, more were added, stacked, one after another, like silence layered over screams. This was called the burial of pressure, a slow-motion execution designed to strip the body of height, volume, presence. You weren't just dying, you were being reduced, and sometimes they made it poetic. In the quarry towns where stone was life, trade, religion, crushing was the only sentence for betrayers. A worker who stole sacred materials, crushed beneath the very block he tried to smuggle. A foreman who conspired against the priesthood, his own workers rolled the slab. And they did it in public. Not because they hated him, because they had to. Because refusing meant sharing the slab. Crushing had rules, regulations. Priests measured the stone, chanted the weight, declared it acceptable to the gods. And in some temples, the stones themselves were carved with names not of the condemned, but of the gods. The idea was clear. This isn't murder. This is divine compression. It wasn't always fatal. That's the other horror. In lesser crimes, blasphemy, fraud, or speaking against temple doctrine, crushing was used as maiming. A leg crushed at the knee, an arm flattened at the elbow. You lived, technically, but not well. A limping blasphemer was the best sermon. There's a record faint, faded, scribbled in the corner of a scribe's ledger, of a man who survived partial crushing. His left side was permanently paralyzed. He became a temple sweeper, assigned to the same courtyard where he'd been condemned. Every day, he passed the stone that ruined him. Every day, he bowed to it. Because he knew it hadn't killed him out of mercy. It had let him live to remember. And crushing wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was symbolic. Entire families were crushed, socially stripped of title, wealth, inheritance. Their names removed from records, their faces removed from tombs, a spiritual flattening. Their legacy compressed until it disappeared between the cracks of history. But when it was physical, it was absolute. There's a tale half fable, half archive of a noble who plotted against Pharaoh. When discovered, he wasn't executed in the palace. He was taken to the Valley of the Kings. A new tomb was being carved. He was placed beneath a foundation stone meant to support the chamber roof. The builders were told, "Lay it. Forget him." They did. His bones are still there, somewhere under 20 tons of limestone, part of the very architecture he tried to undermine. That's the message crushing sends. You can fight the gods, but you will become their foundation. And if crushing was what they did to your body, what happened when the state wanted to reach your mind? When pain wasn't enough? When fear itself became the instrument? Next, we go deeper. We talk blinding. Blinding. The lights go out, but the punishment doesn't end. In ancient Egypt, blinding wasn't just a physical sentence. It was metaphysical. To be blinded was to be unplugged from the divine order, forcibly severed from the world's visual rhythm. In a land where sight was sacred, where the sun god Ra watched from the sky, and Pharaoh was his earthly mirror, losing your eyes meant more than darkness. It meant disconnection. You see, to the Egyptians, the eyes weren't just organs. They were tools of magic, channels for power, mirrors for the soul. The Eye of Horus was one of the most potent symbols in the Egyptian pantheon, an emblem of protection, healing, sacrifice. So when the state took your eyes, it wasn't just punishment. It was symbolic execution. Blinding wasn't common. It was reserved, precise, delivered to traitors, spies, and those who saw what they shouldn't, literally and spiritually. A scribe who read forbidden texts. A priest who entered a holy chamber unclean. A concubine who witnessed a ritual reserved for the gods. You see the wrong thing? You don't see anything again. The method was as brutal as it was symbolic. Sometimes, the eyes were gouged with bronze hooks, small, curved instruments used by embalmers but repurposed for this darker task. The hook slid beneath the lid, behind the eye, and then popped it free. Not surgically, violently. There was no anesthetic, only screams and restraint. Other times, the punishment came through burning. Metal rods sharpened, heated until they glowed like the sun, it's pressed into the sockets. Not enough to kill, just enough to cauterize the organ, to sear it shut forever. The smoke rising from the eyes was said to smell like incense, but no one mistook it for worship. There's a record half lost in a temple ledger of a royal attendant who glimpsed a sacred scroll meant only for Pharaoh. He was blinded at dawn, not in secret, in the palace courtyard. The priest declared him unseeing and unseen, a ghost in the house of light. Blinding wasn't just about physical punishment. It was a rebranding. You didn't just lose your vision, you lost your place in society. In a world where hierarchy was everything, a blind man became liminal, neither dead nor fully alive, dependent, isolated, suspect. He could no longer read texts, couldn't write petitions, couldn't recognize Pharaoh's face, which meant he no longer counted. Some blind men were turned into servants kept in temples, led by ropes, forced to repeat hymns in the dark, a living reminder that even in blindness, obedience was possible. Others were expelled from cities, left to wander the desert fringes with bowls tied to their necks, begging, stumbling, muttering to gods who no longer answered. In rare cases, the blinding was partial. Just one eye. A warning, a mercy, a curse. It depended on the crime, the mood of the judge, and the phase of the moon. There's even mention of ritual blinding, not as punishment, but as purification. During certain cult initiations, initiates were blindfolded for weeks, deprived of sight to enhance their inner vision. But if they failed the test, if they spoke, or peeked, or panicked, then the blindfold came off, and the hot iron went in. You were meant to see the gods within, not the rituals themselves. And there's another layer. a terrifying one. Blinding was sometimes self-inflicted not as penance, but as protection. Slaves tasked with guarding sacred tombs were said to blind themselves voluntarily, so they wouldn't accidentally see the treasures or the sacred curses. Some were blinded after service. As a reward, "You've served the gods. Now we protect you from temptation." A protection that felt a lot like punishment. Even in war, blinding was strategic. Captive spies were sometimes blinded instead of executed, left alive but useless, broken not in body but in direction. A soldier who couldn't see was a soldier who couldn't fight, and the state got to show mercy while still making a point. But the real horror of blinding? It was permanent. There was no redemption arc, no afterlife spell to restore the eyes. The Book of the Dead had instructions for regrowing limbs, mending broken hearts, even purifying a blood-stained soul, but not eyes. Sight, once lost, stayed lost. That was the point. You weren't just punished, you were unmade. Your body was still there, your breath still rose, but your relationship with the world with color, shape, shadow, form was severed. And in a culture that believed in spiritual vision, being blind was as close to ghosthood as a living man could get. But there's one fate more brutal still. Not the loss of vision, but the loss of freedom. When punishment isn't pain, when it's repetition, when it's endless motion in a circle of futility. Let's bind the limbs. Let's remove the choice. Let's talk exile. Exile. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to someone isn't to kill them, it's to make sure they live elsewhere. In ancient Egypt, exile was a punishment carved from silence. No scars, no blood, just distance, isolation, forgetting. It was the slow strangulation of identity, the ultimate form of social and spiritual subtraction. Because in Egypt, where your name, your land, your tomb, and your gods were everything, to be cast out was to be unmade by geography. Exile wasn't a banishment to some exotic paradise. You weren't sent to a nice hilltop with a pension. You were dumped into desert, into borderlands, into places where the Nile didn't reach and the gods didn't listen, into dust. Let's start with what you lost. Your name? Still technically yours, but no one was allowed to speak it in public. No priests would bless it, no scribes would write it. Your lineage would be struck from temple walls. Your children, if they remained, were orphans by law. Your land, reclaimed by the state. Your house gutted, your tomb site reassigned, your animals redistributed. You were legally dead, just inconveniently still breathing. But the worst part? You lost your gods. The state religion was rooted in place. Every city, every temple had its own sacred geography. Bastet reigned in Bubastis, Amun in Thebes, Isis on Philae. To be exiled was to be cut off from the network. Your prayers became static. Your offerings fell on deaf altars. No shrine, no rites, no afterlife. Exile was spiritual homelessness. The actual exile zones varied. Some were known: arid valleys in the eastern desert, border towns near Nubia, remote oases with bad water and worse neighbors. Others were mythical places whispered about but never marked on maps. Beyond the Black Dune, past the mountain that eats men, places where no Nile flowed. You weren't expected to return, and you weren't expected to survive. Exile could be solitary or collective. Sometimes, entire families were cast out, not for crimes they committed, but for proximity to power. A failed coup meant exile for every cousin, scribe, and servant who ever lit a lamp in your hall. There's a record fragmented and scorched of a nobleman who offended the pharaoh, not through treason, but through prophecy. He predicted the wrong future. Pharaoh lost a battle. The prophet was exiled to the desert with nothing but a clay tablet and a sack of dried onions. He wasn't killed, just omitted. And exile wasn't clean. Some were hunted after the fact. If your words reached ears inside Egypt, if your letters made it home, you could be silenced. Exiles who spoke too loudly were accused of breaking the wall of silence and sentenced again. Sometimes by execution, sometimes by erasure. Some tried to return. Most failed. They were caught at city gates, dragged before magistrates, and sentenced to harsher fates. Mutilation, branding, or a second exile, this time with broken legs. Others succeeded. Barely. There's an apocryphal story of a woman exiled for adultery who lived alone in the desert for 22 years. She built her own shrine, wrote her own spells. One day, a priest passing through the region had a dream in which Isis demanded the woman's pardon. She returned, half-starved, sun-scorched, blinking against the temple light. They say her name was restored, they say. But most exiles weren't that lucky. They died unburied, their bodies gnawed by jackals, their souls lost between worlds. Because exile wasn't just distance. It was liminality. You weren't in Egypt, you weren't in the underworld, you were between, forever. And exile wasn't only geographic. There was social exile, the living ghost sentence, where you stayed in your city but no one acknowledged you, not a word, not a glance. You passed through streets as if invisible. Shopkeepers refused service. Priests pretended you didn't exist. Your shadow fell on walls, but no one walked in it. This punishment was called removal of presence, and it could last for years. Imagine, you're alive, technically free, but erased in every way that matters. No friends, no work, no name, just walking, eating, sleeping, waiting to be remembered. Some prisoners begged for exile over other punishments. Better to be cast into the wilderness than lose a hand. Better to wander the dunes than lose your face. But exile was never mercy. It was suspension. You weren't dead. You just didn't belong anywhere. And if exile was the sentence for those the Pharaoh didn't want to see, what happened to the ones he wanted the whole kingdom to look at? The ones who needed to be paraded, humiliated, shattered in full view? Next, we step into the streets. Let's talk public humiliation. Public humiliation. Some punishments bleed, others burn, but few dig as deep as shame. Public humiliation in ancient Egypt wasn't just an add-on to more physical punishments. It was its own sentence, a weapon forged from mockery, spectacle, and silence. If death erased you, and exile exiled you, then public humiliation rewrote you, into a warning, into a joke, into a permanent, living scar across the collective memory. It wasn't about justice. It was about display. The Egyptians believed in cosmic balance ma'at, but when someone broke that balance, sometimes restoring it didn't mean death or mutilation. Sometimes it meant transforming the offender into a symbol, something everyone could see, mock, point at. So they did. The setup was always theatrical. The condemned wasn't just marched through town. They were staged, stripped, painted, branded, leashed, men and women alike. If your crime was theft, you might be paraded with the stolen item tied to your neck. If it was adultery, you might wear symbols of your transgression, a clay phallus, a mask shaped like a jackal's head, or a tunic stained with false blood. The message was blunt. This is what shame looks like. The route mattered. These parades weren't random strolls. They were carefully mapped journeys through marketplaces, temples, plazas everywhere people gathered. The punishment wasn't about feeling shame. It was about broadcasting it. Crowds were encouraged to participate. Not just watch and gauge. They could throw things, mud, dung, rotten onions, Insults, too sharp, practiced, sometimes rehearsed. Scribes have recorded some of the chants. Thief of the gods, eater of sin, Pharaoh's disgrace. Children were allowed to mock. That was key. If even the smallest citizen could laugh at you, your power was truly broken. And it didn't stop at shouting. In some cases, actors were hired to perform mini-plays, mocking the condemned, crude pantomimes, song parodies, skits that exaggerated the crime into slapstick. One scroll describes a noble accused of sleeping with a priestess. His punishment included a puppet show reenactment of the affair, complete with animal noises and a papier-mâché phallus. Humiliation through performance. There were more grotesque variants. Criminals tied to donkeys backwards, forced to ride through town with their faces to the tail. Others were forced to crawl on hands and knees around temples, licking the dust, chanting apologies to the gods with every breath. Some had their heads shaved, not a small thing in Egypt, where hair and wigs were symbols of status and purity. A bald head meant you'd been cleansed, violently. Others were smeared with pitch, tar, or honey left, exposed to insects, as a kind of slow, buzzing penance. The stings were not fatal, just constant. There are records of criminals painted entirely red, the color of deseret. Chaos sand marched as avatars of disorder. The message was clear. This person is not part of Egypt. They are what we stand against. And then there were the masks. Wooden, clay, animal-shaped, deformities exaggerated, donkey ears, stretched tongues, bulging eyes. Some had inscriptions carved into the cheeks. Liar, spy, fool of Ammon. The condemned wore them for days. Sometimes until the straps cut into the skin. Sometimes until the laughter stopped. But it wasn't just about one moment. Public humiliation lingered. Even after the march was over, even after the paint wore off and the masks came off, the social mark remained. People remembered. You were that woman who wore the crocodile mask. That man who kissed the donkey? Your crime became your name. And this was the real sentence. Because in ancient Egypt, identity was everything. Names had power. Faces had magic. When you were publicly humiliated, your true self was overwritten with a caricature, a joke. And once the gods laughed, the spell was sealed. Some never recovered. They left the city, fled to the desert, died in anonymity, or worse, in infamy. Others stayed, became beggars, madmen, half-people. Their shame ate them alive. But a few leaned into it. Some embraced the mockery, became local fools, temple jesters, traveling liars. If you were already a punchline, why not control the script? They walked the fine line between condemned and clown. Protected, in a way, by the very laughter that ruined them. And sometimes, humiliation escalated. A crime mocked today could be punished tomorrow. If the crowd turned cruel, if Pharaoh lost his patience, if a priest saw too much enjoyment in the ritual, the condemned might find themselves yanked from the public square and thrown into something worse, like a pit, or a pyre, or a crocodile's jaws, because humor in Egypt was sacred, but punishment came first. And if public humiliation was for crimes that the gods wanted everyone to see, what did they do to crimes they didn't want seen again? Crimes so severe, so sacrilegious, that even speaking of them risked repeating them? Let's seal the mouth. Let's remove the tongue. Tongue removal. Words built Egypt. Incantations stirred gods. Prayers moved the Nile. Decrees carved into limestone-shaped empires. The tongue was not just flesh, it was a tool of creation, control, and communion with the divine, which made it one of the most dangerous weapons a person could wield. And when it turned against Pharaoh, against temple law, against cosmic balance, they cut it out. Tongue removal wasn't everyday punishment. It was precise, intentional. The scalpel of the legal system, used not for broad strokes, but for surgical silencing. It was the sentence of last resort when lies couldn't be undone, and the mouth had become a threat to order. The process was horrifyingly intimate. Unlike beheading or amputation, which required space, spectacle, or strength, removing a tongue required proximity. You had to look the condemned in the eye, smell their breath, hold their jaw open, insert the knife or hook deep into the mouth, deeper, deeper, and then pull. It didn't come out clean. There were no modern tools, no anesthetics, no antibiotics, just bronze, bone, heat, blood, lots of blood. The tongue is muscular, slippery, and full of arteries. Severing it meant gushing, choking, gurgling. Sometimes it wasn't removed all at once. Sometimes it was peeled sliced in stages. Because pain was part of the sentence. The mouth filled with blood, the throat clogged with screams. Then silence. Sometimes they cauterized the stump with a burning brand, turning the mouth into a sealed ruin. Other times they packed it with salt and linen, then tied the jaw shut with leather straps. "Let the silence set," the priests would say. This wasn't punishment. This was erasure. The reasons varied, but the crimes always had one thing in common: speech. Perjury in temple court, heresy whispered in sacred halls, gossip about Pharaoh's consort, blasphemy screamed at a festival, a song mocking the gods, a poem that praised the wrong ones, a chant in the wrong dialect. The mouth was power, so they broke it. And this went beyond just silence. The tongue was necessary for rituals. Without it, the condemned couldn't speak their name in the afterlife, couldn't recite the spell for not letting the heart speak against you before Osiris, couldn't sing hymns, couldn't defend themselves, couldn't become. Without the tongue, the soul wandered mute. And that terrified the Egyptians. There are records vague, cracked scrolls, tucked into forgotten libraries of entire families punished for the heretical speech of a single member. The father made to watch as his daughter's tongue was taken. The son forced to kneel as his mother gagged on her own blood. Tongue removal wasn't just about one voice. It was about silencing generations. And sometimes it came before death. Traitors caught plotting revolt, especially if the revolt had a slogan or a chant, were silenced first, executed second. It was important, the priests said, that the condemned not speak as they died, not give their last breath to corruption. Others lived, mute, marked, mouths scarred, voices gone, forced to communicate in gesture, in pantomime. Some were enslaved, used as kitchen labor or quarry carriers. Others were paraded in temple sex samples of what happens when speech crosses sacred lines. A man without a tongue can't start a rebellion. He can't charm a jury. He can't pray. But some tried. They carved glyphs into walls, wrote poems with bleeding fingers. One legend tells of a mute woman who carried sand to the temple every day for 10 years, arranging it into words that pleaded for forgiveness. On the 10th year, a priest crushed her message underfoot. Silence, he said, was the truest prayer. The punishment bled into culture. Children were told, "Speak wisely, or your tongue becomes a curse." Scribes warned, "Ink is safer than breath." Even the gods got in on it. Some images of Thoth, the god of writing and knowledge, show him sealing his own mouth, reminding mortals, "What you say stays." And yet, tongue removal wasn't always final. Some tried to rebuild their lives, became mime performers, temple fools, or silent guards. One mute assassin, legend claims, became Pharaoh's most trusted killer, striking without word, without mercy, without betrayal. But most didn't recover. Because in Egypt, silence wasn't peace. It was punishment. And if removing the tongue was about destroying the power of words, what did they do when the whole body was the crime? When flesh itself was treason? Let's cut deeper. Let's castrate. Castration. The ultimate sentence for the most intimate betrayal. In ancient Egypt, castration wasn't just mutilation, it was a metaphysical judgment, a punishment that declared, you are no longer a man, no longer a father, no longer a vessel of lineage, passion, power. Castration was the death of potential, and Egypt wielded it like a scalpel made of shame. It wasn't common. That's important. Castration wasn't handed out like lashes or exile. It was rare, reserved, and monstrous. It was used when someone didn't just break the rules but corrupted them from the inside. Sexual crimes were the usual target. Rape, incest, violation of temple virgins, desecration of sacred sexuality, an act which, in a culture that revered fertility and balance, was cosmic sabotage. And so, the state retaliated by nullifying the offender. They took his ability to create. The process? Brutal, and deliberately so. There were two main methods. The first, simple and savage, involved crushing the testicles between stones. Fast, crude, no cutting, no finesse. The man was pinned, legs spread, and the stones came down, one, then the other. The resulting blood loss was immense. Many didn't survive the shock. The second method was slower, surgical in the cruelest sense. A knife, bronze or obsidian, was heated in fire. The man was strapped down. No sedation, no prayers. The scrotum was sliced, testicles removed. In some cases, even the penis was severed. Total emasculation. Priests sometimes assisted, not because they were executioners, because they were witnesses. Their role was to ensure the cosmic balance was upheld, that the gods were watching, that the punishment was not just legal, but sacred. The wound was sometimes cauterized, other times packed with resin-soaked linen. Infection was inevitable. If you didn't die from the bleeding, you died slowly, deliriously, screaming. But some survived, and they lived lives of silence and disgrace. Castrated men were forbidden from holding priestly office. They could not serve in the military. They were denied burial in certain necropolises. In a society where male lineage was everything, they were a dead end. Fathers denied them. Wives abandoned them. The community treated them as contaminated. And in temples, they were sometimes made to serve ironically as eunuch guards, not for trust, for humiliation. A living example of what happens when a man forgets restraint. And yet, some of them became tools of state. Because a castrated man, it was said, could not be tempted, could not be corrupted. In some periods, they were placed as silent attendants in the royal harem, watching, but never touching. Breathing, but never belonging. Their names were often changed. Broken One, Servant of Fire, Man without seed. Some tried to reclaim meaning. There's a scroll fragment from the reign of Ramses IX, referencing a eunuch who became a poet, writing laments about blood, sand, and shadows. His lines were bitter, sharp, unforgettable. But his name is gone, struck from the record, because even his art was seen as dangerous. In the underworld, castration had consequences. The Book of the Dead rarely speaks directly of eunuchs, but omission speaks volumes. Castrated men weren't granted the same spells of virility, regeneration, or rebirth. They entered the afterlife incomplete. Their spiritual form mirrored their physical mutilation. And the gods? They judged silently. Because Egypt worshipped fertility, worshipped order, worshipped the generative power of both men and women. To remove that was to remove your function, to make you, in the eyes of eternity, irrelevant. But it wasn't just the body that was castrated. It was the voice, the power, the future. Because when the state castrated you, it wasn't just saying, "You've done wrong." It was saying, "You don't get to exist tomorrow." And if castration was the punishment for creating wrongly, what did they do when you destroyed sacred creation? When you reached into a tomb, touched what was holy, and stole from the dead? Let's go grave deep. Let's talk tomb robbing. Tomb robbing. There were crimes, and then there were curses. In ancient Egypt, tomb robbing wasn't just theft, it was desecration, cosmic vandalism, a direct assault on the eternal machinery that kept the dead at peace and the living in balance. To rob a tomb was to steal from the gods and the ghosts. And Egypt responded with fire, with blades, with rituals, with punishments that aimed not only to end you but to make sure the afterlife ended you again. Because tomb robbing wasn't rare. It was epidemic. From the moment the first pyramid was sealed, someone was digging under it. Gold, jewels, oils, amulets, scrolls. Every noble corpse was a treasure chest. And in times of famine, war, or corruption, even priests and guards turned thief. But when they were caught, the state didn't just punish them. It performed ritual vengeance. Let's start with the most infamous source, the Papyrus Leopold II and the Abbot Paparustuo, ancient documents that read like detective thrillers. They describe the investigations of tomb robbers in the Valley of the Kings, complete with interrogations, confessions, and inventories of stolen goods. One thief admitted to breaking into a noble's tomb, melting down his amulets, and selling the gold. Another confessed to burning the mummy for its linen wrappings. The punishment? Immediate execution for some. But for others, they got the full spectrum of divine fury. Tongues cut out, hands severed, eyes gouged, then thrown to the jackal sore, in some cases, reburied in pits filled with broken statuary and animal bones. The message was clear. You wanted tombs? Here's one. But the worst fate? Being buried with the robbed goods. It was a curse masquerading as punishment. The thieves were tied to the stolen coffins, lashed to defiled sarcophagi, then sealed in the tomb chambers alive or dead. It didn't always matter. The logic was grim. You disturbed the dead, now you serve them. Forever. There are traces of this still in tomb shafts, oddly placed bodies, not mummified, without funerary rites, lying face down beside desecrated nobles. No names, no spells, just silence and stone. The priests didn't stop there. They wrote curses, not metaphorical ones, literal, flaming, glyph-carved curses on tomb walls. Invocations that said, "May the robber's heart be devoured, may his shadow dissolve, may his children rot in the womb." These weren't threats. These were spiritual torpedoes set to detonate in the next life. And the gods took it personally. Osiris, Lord of the Dead, was invoked in punishment rituals. Anubis, the jackal-headed embalmer, was called upon to unmake the offender. Even Thoth, the god of record-keeping, was brought in to ensure that the name of the thief was written one sand, then struck out forever. Some trials made examples. Captured robbers were whipped in public, not just beaten named, their crimes shouted in the marketplace, their tools displayed, chisels, oil lamps, crowbars. Their families watched. Their neighbors spat. The ritual wasn't just to hurt them. It was to make the memory of them hurt. In some dynasties, tomb robbers were sentenced to hard labor force to dig new tombs, under guard, using the same tools they'd once used to desecrate the dead. An endless loop of excavation and punishment. And when they died? No burial, no rites, no shroud. Their bodies were dumped outside the necropolis unclean, unmourned, and their names were scrubbed from court records. But the true fear, the one that chilled even hardened criminals, was the afterlife. Because to rob a tomb was to sever a contract. In Egyptian belief, the dead needed their belongings, jewels, food, spells, even the body itself to function in the next world. Take that away, and the soul became trapped, angry, vengeful. Tomb robbers weren't just thieves. They were haunted. There were legend, shaft, myth, half-courtroom record of robbers driven mad by visions, of men who screamed in their sleep, clawed their own skin, begged for the jackal to stop chasing them. One tale tells of a man who tried to rob a high priest of Amun. That night, he vomited scorpions, died with sand in his lungs. His name was never spoken again. And the ultimate irony? Most tomb robbers died poor. Because cursed gold doesn't spend well. Once word got out that a necklace came from a noble's grave, no merchant would touch it. No priest would bless it. It became radioactive. Socially, spiritually, economically toxic. And so, many robbers buried their loot, tried to forget it, tried to outlive the curse. They didn't, because in Egypt, the dead had laws, and they enforced them. So if tomb robbing triggered divine annihilation, what punishment waited for those who killed a God's servant? Not a priest, not a noble, but a pharaoh. Let's enter the darkest courtroom in Egyptian history. Let's unveil the harem conspiracy. The harem conspiracy. If ancient Egypt had a courtroom drama, this was it. The year was 1155 BCE. The pharaoh was Ramesses III. And behind the veil of royal opulence, scented halls, and gold-threaded linens, a conspiracy was hatching inside the very walls of the palace. Not from an enemy army, not from a rebellious priesthood, but from the women who shared his bed. It would become one of the most shocking betrayals in Egyptian history. And the punishments? Brutal, inventive, biblical in scope. This was not just a coup attempt. This was an offense against divinity. Because the pharaoh wasn't just king, he was a living god. And someone tried to kill him. Let's rewind. Ramesses III ruled during a time of economic stress, political fragmentation, and rising court tension. Food shortages, delayed wages, priesthoods gaining power, the perfect pressure cooker. And at its center was Queen Tiano, the chief wife, but a minor one. Ambitious, furious, and scheming. She wanted her son, Pentower, on the throne. But the crown was promised to another, the heir of the chief queen, Isis. So Ta did what many have done in history when the line of succession blocks their path. She plotted a murder, and she wasn't alone. The conspiracy stretched like cracks. In a temple column, harem servants, court officials, palace guards, even magicians. They bribed guards to leave gates open. They forged documents. They invoked spells. They planned to strike during a festival when Pharaoh would be distracted, vulnerable. And then? It failed. Ramesses III diegesis, but not the way they planned. Some evidence suggests he may have been wounded, his throat cut. Others argue he survived the initial plot and was killed later, in secret. Either way, the conspiracy unraveled before the new pharaoh could be crowned. What followed was not a trial. It was an inquisition. Dozens of suspects were rounded up. Men, women, nobles, slaves. The court assembled in secret chambers. Judges were appointed, their names cloaked in ceremonial anonymity. This wasn't about justice. This was about purification. And then the sentences came down like hammers. Many were executed, but not cleanly. Some were forced to commit suicidia, rare and sinister sentence. They were brought to a quiet room, handed knives or poison, and given a choice: die now or be killed ritually. Those who complied were spared public disgrace. Those who resisted, they were mutilated, blinded, their noses and ears removed. One was allegedly burned alive. Another had his tongue ripped out and was paraded through the temple square. But the most infamous punishment? Prince Pentaur, the son of Pharaoh, the usurper who never sat on the throne. He was found guilty. Not executed like a commoner, not exiled like a traitor, but sentenced to die by his own hand. The record is vague, purposefully so, but evidence suggests he hanged himself. In shame, in fear, in defeat. The body of a young man, mouth gaping, face twisted in agony, was found in a side tomb mummified, buried in goatskin, denied all honors. The Egyptians believed the soul of this man would wander eternally, nameless and unloved. This wasn't punishment. This was obliteration. The others? They were buried without names. Their families were struck from the records, their estates seized, their tombs, if they had any, were cursed. One judge, accused of sympathizing with the conspirators, was forced to walk through the city with a sign, "Friend of Traitors." He was then beaten to death outside the Temple of Amun. And still, the state wasn't done. The conspiracy was immortalized on papyrus, not to be remembered, but to be feared. The judicial papyrus of Turin, preserved through centuries, details the accusations, confessions, and punishments. A blueprint of royal wrath, a guidebook of divine vengeance. A lesson? Don't touch Pharaoh. Don't touch the throne. Don't whisper behind the veil. Because Egypt might forgive theft. It might tolerate heresy. But treason against the divine? That called for something more. And if the death of a god-king unleashed this level of fury, what punishment was reserved for those who weren't even criminals, but simply servants? When the pharaoh died, and he chose to take you with him? Not as a traitor, but as an offering. Let's enter the first dynasty. Let's meet the retainer sacrifices. Retainer sacrifices. Imagine serving your master faithfully your whole life only to be buried with him at death. Not alongside, not in honor. Buried with him. Alive or freshly dead, it hardly mattered. In the first dynasty of ancient Egypt, loyalty wasn't a metaphor, it was a sentence. A sentence sealed in limestone in rows of skulls in the silent tombs of Abydos. This was the era of retainer, sacrifices, the ancient world's most elite human resources policy. And it was horrifying. Let's set the stage. We're talking 3100 BCE. The ink of unification still wet on the parchment of history. Egypt was young, but already ambitious. The pharaoh's Narmer. Aha! weren't just kings. They were living gods, walking pillars of divine will. And when a god dies, he doesn't travel to the afterlife alone. He takes his staff. The earliest royal tombs at Abydos weren't just single chambers. They were complexes. Dozens, even hundreds, of subsidiary graves arranged like spokes around the king's final resting place. Each one containing the body of a servant, an administrator, a cook, a guard, a child. Yes, children. These weren't symbolic burials. These were real people, buried at the same time as their master. Their necks snapped, their hands folded, their mouths sealed. In some cases, the bodies showed signs of drugging, perhaps, to calm them. In others, signs of struggle. They didn't all go quietly. Historians once debated whether these were voluntary deaths, devoted servants asking to join their master in death, but the evidence says otherwise. Mass burials, identical grave goods, uniform positioning. This wasn't devotion. This was ritualized execution. A system. And it wasn't done in secret. This was pageantry. A procession of sacrifice. When a pharaoh died, his household prepared not for mourning, but for transfer. The idea was simple. In the afterlife, the king would need the same crew he had in life: scribes to take notes, butchers to prepare meat, singers to praise him, and the only way to ensure that? Kill them. This practice peaked under Pharaoh Jer. His tomb at Abydos includes over 300 subsidiary graves. 300. That's not a funeral. That's a purge. Each servant had a small chamber, modest grave goods, no name. The king? Lavish. It wasn't just death. It was class death. Cosmic hierarchy in full grim display. And the gods approved. Texts from later periods reference this practice with reverence, not horror. These were the blessed ones, the king's eternal retinue. Their sacrifice ensured the smooth transition of power. A pharaoh without his servants in the next life? Vulnerable, powerless. Better to kill a few hundred now than risk chaos later. But eventually, it stopped. By the end of the first dynasty, retainer sacrifices faded out. Why? Unclear. Maybe public opinion soured. Maybe priests intervened. Maybe tomb designers invented Shabtai figurine small servant statues that could magically labor in the afterlife, no blood required. A win-win. Keep the staff and the kingdom. Or maybe the servants just ran out of patience. There's no record of revolt, but there are signs that later tombs replaced human graves with fake graves-mock tombs filled with offerings, not bodies. The ritual remained. The murder ended. But the memory didn't. Even millennia later, the ghosts of those sacrifices lingered in the culture. Myths of servants who followed Pharaoh to the field of reeds. Warnings whispered to young acolytes, serve the king well, but not too well. And the bones? Still there. Still curled in sand. Still silent. Their mouths never cursed the system. Because they couldn't. They weren't just sacrificed. They were erased. And if sacrificing the innocent for a pharaoh's journey feels extreme, what happens when the state doesn't just want to kill you? What happens when it wants to curse you? Forever. Next, let's break clay. Let's talk execration rituals. Execration rituals. There are many ways to punish the body, but Egypt had ways to punish the soul remotely. Enter the execration rituals. Egypt's dark art of spiritual warfare. No blades, no fires, no chains, just clay, ink, and the fury of the gods condensed into a single word curse. To the modern eye, it might look like nothing: a doll, a jar, a broken pot. To the ancient Egyptians, it was an execution in effigy, an invisible strike, the most chilling kind of punishment. The one that doesn't need your presence to end you. Here's how it worked. The priests trained in the sacred arts of protection and destruction would take an object, usually clay or stone, sometimes wax. It could be shaped like a person, a foreigner, an enemy, or left unformade a blank canvas for divine wrath. Onto this object, they'd inscribe a name. Not just any name. Your name. And with that, you were doomed. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't voodoo or idle superstition. This was a bureaucratic process, an official rite, carried out in temple vaults, on festival days, during military campaigns, or before royal coronations, anytime the state needed to secure its survival and eliminate its threats. They wrote your name in hieroglyphs, alongside your title, your city, your crimes real or imagined. They listed your offenses like charges in court. The liar, the rebel, the thief of grain, the defiler of sacred ground, the enemy of Pharaoh. Then came the ritual. The clay figure was spat on, trampled, smeared with excrement, sometimes urinated on. Priests stabbed it with knives, hacked it with axes, or pounded it with stones. Every blow was symbolic. Every strike, a spiritual hammer. Then they shattered it, broke it into pieces, crushed the name. Some shards were buried under temple thresholds, so every step across the sacred floor pressed the curse deeper into the earth. Others were thrown into fire or cast into the Nile, where the river would carry your name into oblivion. You never saw it coming. You might live in another city, miles away, completely unaware that your life had been sentenced, that your health, your wealth, your future had been compromised by a ritual carried out in silence. Execration rituals weren't just about individuals. Whole nations were cursed. The enemies of Egypt, Libyans, Hittites, Asiatics, had their kings and warriors named in these rituals. Entire tribes condemned by name, their cities represented by doll-sized fortresses made of clay, stomped flat under divine feet. One cache of execration texts, found near modern-day Luxor, listed over 400 enemy names. Some were foreigners. Others were Egyptian nobles' internal threats, rivals, rebels. You didn't have to lift a sword to be cursed. You just had to exist in the wrong context. And the scariest part? It worked. At least, people believed it did. There are records of crops failing after such rituals, of rival kings dying mysteriously, of civil unrest calming. The priests took credit. The gods took credit. Pharaoh took credit. The cursed? They took silence. Because these rituals weren't just about vengeance, they were about order. The act of cursing was a sacred form of political hygiene, a way to scrub the realm of disharmony, no bloodshed required. Just names, just ink. And if you were ever forgiven, the pieces of your broken effigy were gathered, washed in holy water, buried in sanctified soil, a reversal of the cursorari, but possible. More often, you remained in shards, somewhere beneath the temple floor, still stepped on, still damned. Even your children could be cursed by association, your name passed down not as lineage, but as legacy of failure, betrayal, heresy. Execration was the state's most elegant punishment. No guards, no trials, no tombs, just absence. So what do we make of it? That Egypt, so obsessed with balance, found a way to kill without touching, a method of punishment so terrifying, so clean, that it left no scar, just consequence. Absolutely. Let's skip forced suicide and move straight into the next punishment. Nose cutting. The face is identity. In ancient Egypt, where visual symbolism ruled everything from tomb art to divine iconography, your face was your name, in image form. So when the state wanted to mark you as unclean, traitorous, or utterly disgraced, it didn't go for your heart or your tongue. It went for your nose. Nose cutting wasn't just mutilation. It was a permanent, public badge of dishonor. A punishment so visible, so undeniable, that it turned your body into its own wanted poster. You could walk free, technically, but you carried your crime on your face. Let's be clear. The Egyptians weren't squeamish about facial mutilation. They understood its power. A missing nose wasn't just grotesque, it was symbolic. It said, "This person cannot be trusted. This person has betrayed the order. This person's face no longer deserves to reflect the face of the gods." So, they cut it. The method? Sharp, fast, brutal. Bronze blades, obsidian knives, sometimes bone saws depending on the precision desired. Some cuts were straight across the bridge, others removed the cartilage entirely. In worst cases, the whole mid-face was carved out, leaving a crater that never closed properly. There was blood, there was screaming, there was infection, and when it was over, there was shame. But why the nose? Because it sat at the center of everything. In Egyptian magic, the breath was sacred. The nose wasn't just for smelling, it was a conduit for the Ka, the life force, you breathe your soul, you sniff incense offered to the gods. You inhale the essence of rituals. Take the nose, and you sever that link. You're alive, technically, but no longer whole in spirit. The crimes that earned nose cutting varied. Adultery was a big one, especially for women. A noble woman caught in an affair, nose gone. A concubine who dared lie with someone other than Pharaoh, nose gone. It wasn't just personal betrayal. It was political. In one record, a court musician was found in the bed of a high priest. The punishment? Both had their noses cut off and were paraded through Thebes. The priest was stripped of his title. The musician was forced to play with a reed flute tied around his stump of a face. Laughter followed, so did vomiting. Other crimes? Treason, blasphemy, certain forms of lying, especially those that disrupted temple rituals or falsely accused the innocent. In these cases, the nose was seen as the offending sense. You smelled out secrets. You sniffed where you didn't belong. So the state made sure you couldn't do that again. There's even evidence that some communities used nose cutting as a civil punishment. Local magistrates, lacking the resources for imprisonment, simply mutilated the convicted. One swift cut, and the criminal was marked for life. No guards required. The punishment spread beyond Egypt too. In later periods, especially under Persian occupation, nose cutting became a common punishment for scribes who altered records. The logic? A liar's face should be incomplete, just like their truth. And the long-term effects? Disfigurement, respiratory issues, constant infection, difficulty eating, drinking, even speaking. Victims often wore veils or masks. But masks, in Egypt, had religious connotations usually reserved for the dead. So wearing one as a living person? A walking blasphemy. It wasn't just the individual who suffered. Their families were affected too. Children mocked, wives abandoned, lineages tainted. In the afterlife? The consequences were worse. Without a complete face, you couldn't pass the judgment of Osiris. The gods needed to recognize you, and if they saw a mutilated face, they looked away. No entry, no field of reeds. Just darkness. There were rare cases of reconstruction. Scribes wrote of attempts to build wax noses, gold replacements, wooden prosthetics, but they were unstable, smelly, and usually fell off. And even if they worked, everyone still knew. You can't hide a scar when it's shaped like a crime. But perhaps the darkest twist? Sometimes nose cutting wasn't done for punishment at all. Sometimes it was used by enemies as false punishment, a way to frame someone. Mutilate a man, say he's been punished by the state, and ruin his life without a trial. These ghost punishments haunted the cities, turning every noseless face into a question mark. What did he do? Did he do anything? And that's the terrifying genius of it. You didn't need a conviction. You just needed a blade. And if nose cutting was about stealing a person's face, what happened when the ears were next? Let's listen closely. Let's talk ear cutting. Ear cutting. The gods gave you ears to listen to the laws, to the priests, to the heartbeat of Maat. So when you failed to listen, when you heard sacred truths and twisted them, or when you let heresy in one ear and lies out the other, Egypt took the ears. Ear cutting wasn't as dramatic as mutilation of the face, nor as final as tongue removal or castration, but it was chillingly effective. It marked you as someone who had heard too much, or worse heard and did nothing. It was punishment for the passive crime, the sin of inaction or disobedient hearing. It said, you weren't just guilty, you were warned and ignored it. The sentence was exacting. Sometimes one ear, sometimes both. The choice was symbolic. One ear for a first offense, meaning you'd been partially deaf to order. 2 ears for full rebellion. Silence you didn't earn, the state earned it for you. The process? Raw. A curved knife, a slice at the base, skin, cartilage, nerve gone in one shriek. Blood sprayed. It always sprayed. Even a single ear bled like a mouth screaming for help. No anesthetic. No comfort. Just ropes to hold you down and a priest to recite the charge. The bleeding was often stopped with a hot brand or a poultice of honey and ash, both sacred and practical. But the scar? That stayed. This wasn't hidden damage. This was broadcasting. A person with no ear, sir. A jagged scar where one had been was. A walking confession. A lesson in flesh. You didn't have to speak. You didn't have to move. The ears told your story for you. And the crimes? Surprisingly varied. Temple violations were a favorite. A scribe who fell asleep during a hymn. A laborer who overheard sacred chants and repeated them in jest. A servant who eavesdropped on a priest's private conversation. In a society where sound was power, the unauthorized hearing of divine secrets was considered a high crime. And in domestic law, ear-cutting was sometimes used for disobedience, especially among servants or slaves who were caught ignoring commands. The master would drag them before a magistrate, testify that their orders had been defied, and the sentence was carried out that day. No trial. No argument. You heard what was said. You chose not to obey. So now, you don't get to hear anything again. Even in military law, the punishment found its niche. Deserters, especially those who claimed not to have heard the call to battle, were often marked this way. Your ears failed you, the general would say. Let's correct that. There's a tale of a palace guard who refused to raise the alarm during a suspicious noise in the night. The next morning, both ears were removed. His job became ceremonially stood at the gate, silent, deaf, and mutilated, a monument to hesitation. Sometimes, the sentence was paired with branding. An ear gone, a scar burned into the temple, double shame, double visibility. You didn't just fail the state, you wore that failure. The punishment reached even into theology. The gods were said to hear everything. So when a mortal turned deaf to justice, he defied the very structure of the cosmos. Some priests even claimed that ear-cutting allowed the gods to speak into the soul directly, bypassing the flawed human sense. But in truth, it was a muzzle, a slow erasure of status. And like so many Egyptian punishments, the consequences bled into the afterlife. In some burial spells, the soul was required to hear the voice of the gatekeeper in the Duate underworld. Without ears, you missed the instructions, you wandered, you failed the tests. Your soul never arrived. And the living feared that. So they hid the earless. Families buried them away from ancestral tombs. Priests denied them final rites. One record describes a man whose ears were cut for mocking temple dancers. When he died, his body was found dumped outside the necropolis, face down in the sand, his head wrapped in linen as if to hide the shame even in death. But some wore their scars as weapons. Exiles, thieves, heretics, they leaned into the silence, became symbols of resistance. I hear no gods, they'd scrawl on stone. I follow my own law. These rebels didn't last long, but their absence echoed. And that's the thing. Egypt could forgive failure, but not listening? That was treason. And if they could cut your ears for failing to hear, what did they do when the crime was so grotesque, so unholy, so unspeakable, that the only answer was to unskin your entire head? Let's take the scalp. Let's talk scalping. Scalping. The hair of a god. The crown of power. The headdress of the divine. In ancient Egypt, the head wasn't just biology, it was symbolism. It was sacred territory. And the hair? That was the frame, the sign of strength, youth, status. To be scalped was to be stripped of that, to be unmasked, exposed, disowned by the very aesthetic of order. And so, when punishment needed to be primal, when it needed to erase dignity in the most graphic way possible, Egypt reached for the knife and took the scalp. Unlike tongue removal or castration, scalping was not about disabling, it was about display, a kind of raw, ritualized disfigurement that spoke louder than any edict. A silent scream flayed across your skull. It wasn't common, but it happened, especially during moments of extreme state paranoia, rebellion, blasphemy, treason that stained not just the law, but the very fabric of Ma'at. When someone needed to be made into a lesson and a trophy scalping was chosen, the method was pure brutality. The condemned was bound, kneeling or prone, while executioners, sometimes soldiers, sometimes temple guards, stuck a flint or bronze blade to the crown of the head. The first cut pierced flesh. The second peeled, and from there it was muscle memory. A circle, a pull, and then the scream, because it didn't come off easily. Scalping involved more than pain. It was tearing, ripping. The skin of the scalp is rich with nerves, blood, and resistance. When removed, it exposed the skull to air, to sun, to flies. The bleeding was horrific, the humiliation worse. And that was the point. In some cases, the removed scalp was displayed tacked to temple doors, hung from spears, or nailed to walls near city gates. A literal banner of disobedience. This is what happens when you try to crown yourself above Pharaoh. And sometimes, it wasn't even your crime. Scalping could be collective punishment. A rebel leader's entire family, his inner circle, his personal guards, all scalped, not killed, necessarily marked, made to live without identity, without dignity. Because in Egypt, a shaved head was ritual purity. A scalped head was something else entirely. A scarlet mark of spiritual pollution. There are scrolls that mention the red-headed ghosts, men who survived scalping and wandered through the Nile Delta, considered cursed. Children threw stones at them. Priests refused to make eye contact. Farmers wouldn't let them touch the crops for fear the fields would rot. And in the military, scalping became trophy keeping. Captured enemies, specially during border wars with Nubians or Libyans, sometimes scalped post-mortem. Their heads paraded through the capital, their hair offered to temples, their skulls carved with victory glyphs. A twisted inversion of honor. Instead of burial, they were used. Their hair became relics. Their bones became decor. Even pharaohs boasted of scalp trophies. One inscription, attributed to Ramesses II, claims he took the crowns of 100 foreign kings, which was poetic language for a grim truth. He scalped them, took their royal hair, reduced their titles to trophies. And yes, there were rituals for that too. Priests would cleanse the scalps, dry them, smear them with oils. Some were even buried as offerings in temples, meant to ward off future rebellion. You don't need to execute your enemies if their ghosts are already being stepped on. And in the afterlife, the scalped were doomed. The head is vital in Egyptian cosmology. The bathed soul's mobile form needed to recognize the body in order to return. A disfigured head, a soul with nowhere to land, lost, trapped in the duat, screaming silently through eternity. That's why some tried to hide it. Scalped victims wore crude wigs or leather caps. One even fashioned a crown of reeds, braided into a makeshift identity. But it didn't fool anyone, because you can't disguise what's been torn away, and you can't rebuild what's been flayed from the root. So, if scalping was what happened to rebels and traitors, what punishment awaited the soul thieves? The grave breakers? The ones who didn't just offend the gods or Pharaoh, but death itself? Let's return to the crypt. Let's break into the punishments for mummification desecration. Mummification, Desecration. To the ancient Egyptians, the mummified body was not just sacred, it was the soul's anchor, the vessel that housed eternity. Every cut, wrap, and resin-soaked fold of linen was a spiritual technology, a preservation spell, a passport to the field of reeds. So when someone desecrated a mummy, unwrapped it, stole from it, burned it, they weren't just committing a crime. They were ripping the soul out of time. And the punishment? The full wrath of a civilization obsessed with death. Desecrating a mummy wasn't just theft or vandalism. It was cosmic sabotage. The body was everything. It had to be whole, named, honored, and protected. Without it, the spirit couldn't survive. Couldn't navigate the duat. Couldn't even be. So when someone violated that, the state didn't just punish them. It tried to reverse them. Let's start with what mummification desecration meant. Sometimes it was theft-stripping gold amulets from within the wrappings, peeling away linen to get to the burial goods. Sometimes it was driven by politics defacing the corpse of a previous ruler or a disgraced official. Other times it was pure spite, enemies of the state buried and later exhumed for punishment that extended after death. And when caught, the desecrators were treated as walking infections. The first punishment was usually mutilation. Hands severed, tongues removed, noses cut, because these were the tools of the desecration. If you touched the mummy with your fingers, you lost them. If you spoke curses at it, you lost your tongue. The mutilation mirrored the crime. But that was just the beginning. The real punishment was spiritual. Desecrators were often denied burial. That alone was catastrophic. No tomb, no mummification, no amulets, no name. They were buried in pits, face down, limbs broken. Some were burned, turning the final sentence into cosmic annihilation. Because a burned body was irreparable. No resurrection, no judgment, no reunion with the gods. But others were cursed more subtly. Cursed names. Priests would take clay tablets, write the offender's name on them, and smash them during rituals. The idea was to splinter the soul, to prevent it from reforming. The pieces would be buried under latrines, in temple trash heaps, in cursed ground, forever fragmented. Some were wrapped like mummies themselves, but in reverse. One arm pinned behind the back, head twisted, feet bound inwards, an inversion of the sacred pose, a warning to the soul that even in death, it was unwelcome. And if the desecration was political, say, an attack on a royal mummy, then the punishment scaled up. Entire families might be punished, property seized, ancestors' tombs desecrated in retaliation. The logic was brutal and poetic. You destroy one mummy, we destroy 5. One scroll from the Third Intermediate Period details such a case. A group of tomb workers stole from a royal cache, including from the embalmed remains of a prince. When discovered, they were sentenced not just to death, but to posthumous damnation. After execution, their corpses were wrapped in pigskin material considered unclean, burned, and their ashes fed to crocodiles. Total erasure, body, spirit, name. And here's the irony. The crime wasn't always committed by thieves. Sometimes the state desecrated mummies. When a dynasty was overthrown, the victors would dig up old kings, defile their corpses, steal their gold, smash their cartouches. Then they'd rewrap the body wrong, bury it in a lesser tomb, and pretend it was never royal. A punishment after the fact. A judgment handed down by history itself. Even the gods weren't spared. When heretics gained power like Akhenaten's followers, they destroyed mummies of high priests, burned relics, unwrapped sacred bulls, scattered bones. They didn't just reject tradition, they executed it. And the punishment for such sacrilege? Legend says they suffered unnatural deaths. their families cursed, their names erased, their own burials vandalized by mobs, by priests, by fate. Because in Egypt, death wasn't an ending. It was an economy, an architecture, a divine machine. And desecrating that machine meant inviting chaos. It meant being hunted not just by the state, but by the dead themselves. So if desecrating a mummy got you damned for eternity, what did they do to those who defiled the living gods? The walking, ruling incarnations of Ra and Horus? Let's finish at the summit. Let's talk the ultimate crime and the most extreme punishment. Attempting to kill a pharaoh. Attempting to kill a pharaoh, there were crimes. And then there was this. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He was a god incarnate, irrefutable, infallible. His words moved armies. His breath stirred rituals. His image adorned temples not because he led the state, but because he was the state, the spine of Ma'at, the sun in flesh. So to raise a hand against Pharaoh was to strike at the gods themselves. It wasn't just high treason. It was cosmic terrorism. The punishment had to reflect that. It couldn't be swift. It couldn't be subtle. It had to burn into the memory of the people and the bedrock of the world. So they made it hurt. The process began with exposure. The accused wasn't tried in private. He was paraded hands bound, face uncovered through the courts, through the temples, sometimes through the streets. This was not about proof. It was about performance. The crowd gathered. The priests watched. The court scribes sharpened their reeds. And the list of charges was read aloud. Attempted regicide, divine assault, cosmic disruption. And with that, the condemned was no longer a man. He was a disease. There were variations in the sentence, each more terrifying than the last. The classic punishment? Dismemberment. But not just to kill, to unmake. The hand severed first, as the instruments of betrayal. Then the feet, so the offender could never walk the halls of eternity. The genitals, to end his line. The tongue, to silence his legacy. Then the heart offered not to the gods, but to fire. This wasn't execution. This was spiritual extermination. The remains were scattered. No burial. No tomb. No afterlife. Sometimes even the blood was collected and poured into temple, drained symbolically, flushing the offender's soul into oblivion. And that was for the guilty. For the accused, same fate, because even the whisper of intent was enough. Attempted regicide didn't require successful assassination. It didn't even require contact, a plan, a dream, a loose word, a single misplaced blade. That was enough. And it wasn't always just the individual. Attempted regicide was a network crime. One offender meant dozens of bodies, co-conspirators, family members, scribes, servants who must have known. They all paid. The state swept through the accused's household like a sandstorm. Children, branded, wives, exiled, estates, seized, pets, slaughtered. And the name? Gone. Struck from records. Removed from tomb walls. Erased from cartouches. This was damnatio memoriae on steroids. In one famous case, the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, entire sectors of the palace were purged. Bodies littered the execution yards. Some weren't even named. Just recorded as traitor or worm. One was mummified in disgrace, wrapped without ceremony, denied a coffin, his corpse jammed into a side tomb like temple trash. Other punishments got creative. One would-be assassin was fed alive to sacred animals. Not crocodiles. Cats. Dozens of temple cats, trained to claw and bite, released into a chamber where the man was bound and soaked in milk and oil. He screamed for 3 days before dying. The priests called it rebalance. In another case, a would-be killer was buried beneath the steps of the temple he had walked as a nobleman. Each visitor unknowingly trampled his corpse. His bones became part of the floor, a human welcome mat. And then there were the ritual punishments. Priests would enact symbolic executions of the traitor every year. Clay dolls bearing his name were smashed at festivals. Scrolls depicting his dismemberment were read aloud during coronations. One pharaoh reportedly had the traitor's name carved backwards on temple walls so the soul would never find its way home. The idea was this: you didn't just die for touching Pharaoh. You died again, and again, and again. Forever. And even after the punishment, the legacy of your crime lived on. Your family name turned poisonous. Your descendants forced to change lineage, lie about ancestry, flee to outer provinces. In one case, a village was renamed because it produced a regicide. They changed the glyphs, scratched them off road markers, buried them under new inscriptions, as if to say, he never existed, we never existed. And that's the core of it. To attempt to kill a pharaoh wasn't just a political crime. It was a cosmological rupture, a theological heresy, a scar on the face of time. And Egypt knew how to deal with scars. By burning them off, by carving them deeper, by making sure no one ever forgotten, that no one ever remembered. And if that was the punishment for one man's ambition, what about an entire movement? What about those who tried to rewrite the gods themselves? We've covered blood, fire, chains, and shadow. Now let's end where it all begins, with the destruction of identity itself. Let's talk damnatio memoriae one last time, in its purest form. Final damnatio memoriae, the annihilation of identity. There's erasure, and then there's unbeing. In ancient Egypt, memory was immortality. Your name, your image, your cartouches weren't decorations. They were spiritual infrastructure. You needed them to survive the afterlife, to be known to the gods, to walk in the light of Ma'at. So when someone threatened Egypt, not just with rebellion or blasphemy, but with ideological annihilation, a rewriting of truth, a replacement of the gods, a reprogramming of eternity, Egypt responded with its most extreme weapon: total damnatio memoriae. Not deletion, annihilation. The blueprint was Akhenaten. Pharaoh, revolutionary, heretic. He didn't try to kill Pharaoh, he was Pharaoh, and yet he defied thousands of years of religious order by discarding the old gods. He raised Aten, the sun disk, above all, closed temples, defunded priests, erased Amun, banned images of deities that had shaped Egypt since before time had a name. He moved the capital, changed the art, rewrote the prayers. He dared to change truth. And for a time, he succeeded. But when he died, Egypt didn't just reverse course. It deleted him. His name scraped from walls, his statues smashed, his temples dismantled stone by stone, his body hidden, his children scattered, his descendants stripped of power, titles, and face. What happened to Akhenaten was not revenge. It was cosmic surgery. Egypt was cutting out an infection. His tomb was left unfinished. His mummy, if ever found, was mutilated beyond recognition. His sarcophagus broken. His likenesses shattered. No cartouches, no inscriptions, no legacy. In official king lists, he was skipped entirely, his reign erased as if it had never happened. His city Akhenaten, the city of the horizon, was abandoned and cannibalized, its stones repurposed to build new temples. His legacy became literal building material for the gods he tried to destroy. But Egypt didn't stop with Akhenaten. They hunted everyone associated with him. His wife, Nefertiti possibly defaced, erased, her fate unknown. His son, Tutankhaten, renamed Tutankhamun, Amun restored, Aten forgotten. His viziers, artists, scribes reassigned or executed. The entire movement was labeled a time of darkness, its monuments condemned, its philosophy anathematized. Even the style of art he championed softer, more emotional, more human was discarded. The stiff, formal forms returned. Faces became masks again. Because even how people looked under Akhenaten became part of the heresy. This was the ultimate punishment. Not execution, not mutilation, but non-existence. A kind of cultural vacuum where a man, a king, a god on earth was turned into an unperson, where even speaking his name became taboo, where the only memory that survived was the memory of his destruction. But here's the twist. It didn't work. Today, Akhenaten is one of the most studied, most discussed, most remembered pharaohs of all time. His city has been excavated, his image restored, his legacy, once scattered across ruins, now sits in museums around the world. Because Egypt's most extreme punishment designed to erase forever preserved him in mystery. The gods, it seems, aren't the only ones with a sense of irony. Tattooing and permanent marking. Not every punishment in ancient Egypt ended with blood. Some left ink. When the state didn't want to kill you, and exile was too soft, and mutilation too visible, it reached for something subtler and more permanent. A mark, a symbol, a tattoo burned or pricked into your skin, branding you for life as a living indictment. This wasn't decoration, it wasn't body art. This was punishment by permanence. Tattooing in ancient Egypt is a complex subject. Most of what survives archaeologically are tattoos on woman symbols of fertility, protection, or religious devotion. But punishment tattoos? That's a darker, more elusive layer. Less beautiful, more brutal. This wasn't about expressing identity. It was about defining it. Let's say you committed a crime, not high treason, something moderate petty theft, tax evasion, temple defilement, disobedience to superiors. You weren't worth killing, but you weren't worth trusting either. So they inked you onto your wrist, your shoulder, your cheek, your forehead in some cases. Glyphs that said thief, liar, enemy of Ma'at. Sometimes it wasn't a word, just a mark, a curse symbol, a broken ink, a reversed feather, something the gods would recognize and reject. The methods varied. Some used ink and bone needles, pricking pigment into the skin like traditional tattoos. Others used branding irons-burned symbols instead of colored ones. Both hurt, both scarred, both shouted. There's a scroll fragmented, brittle, scorched at the corners that mentions a scribe punished for falsifying land measurements. He was branded with a glyph for false balance, the scale tipped unnaturally, burned into his shoulder so the gods would always weigh him unfairly. He lived, but he never held a reed pen again. Another tale speaks of a woman caught spreading false omens during a religious festival. She was tattooed with the glyph for disharmony on her neck, right beneath the jawline, visible, permanent. A silencing spell she wore until her death. The punishment wasn't just personal, it was social. Tattooed criminals couldn't testify in court, couldn't serve in temples, couldn't be buried with full rites. Their marks barred them from purity, from community, from eternity. And it stuck. Even generations later, descendants of marked individuals face stigma. Your grandfather bore the feather turned backward, they'd say. Your blood runs crooked. Some tried to hide the marks. With linen, with ash, with forged blessings, But hiding from the gods was harder than hiding from people, and in Egypt, that was the real concern. A marked man might sneak into the market, but he couldn't sneak into the afterlife. And if the tattoo faded, the curse didn't. It was spiritual ink. And there were darker variations. During periods of political unrest, rebels were branded with reversed royal cartouche-twisted hieroglyphs signifying false pharaoh. They became walking satire. Their very skin mocked their ambition. Some were even tattooed with the names of the gods they'd defiled, ironically, a way of ensuring the gods would see them and reject them. But here's the paradox. Some of these marks survived longer than the people who ordered them. Long after a criminal died, their tattooed skin, sometimes preserved in arid conditions, was found by tomb robbers or archaeologists. The ink still dark, the punishment still legible. A ghost with a name tag. That's the cruel genius of it. Because while other punishments scarred the body or broke the soul, tattooing and branding did both. You carried your crime. You became the sentence. And if Egypt could mark you in life, what did it do when it wanted to punish you after death? Not just by curse, but by desecration? Let's slice deeper into memory. Let's talk corpse mutilation. Corpse mutilation. In ancient Egypt, death was not the end. It was a beginning, a process. A journey through the duat, the underworld, a maze of spirits, tests, gods, and judgment. The body was your passport, your anchor, the vehicle that carried your soul to eternity. So when Egypt wanted to punish you beyond death, it went for the corpse. Corpse mutilation wasn't random desecration. It was systematic deconstruction, the final, irreversible insult, a rejection of your right to eternity. A punishment designed not to make you suffer, but to make you disappear. It started with denial. The criminal, whether executed or dead of natural causes, was denied embalming. This was step one. No oils, no natron, no linen, no canopic jars. The organs were left to rot. The body to bloat and blacken. The sacred preparation that guaranteed resurrection, revoked. But sometimes, that wasn't enough. So they destroyed the corpse. How? They burned it, they chopped it, they unwrapped it, they fed it to dogs. Not metaphorically, literally. In one chilling account, a tax official caught embezzling from a temple was executed then. His body was dismembered and thrown into the Nile, not as a burial, but as a message. Fish ate him. His bones scattered, his soul drowned. Because, in Egyptian belief, a fragmented body meant a fragmented soul. No body equals no reunion in the afterlife. And sometimes it went further still. The corpse was mutilated ceremonially. Eyes removed so the dead couldn't see the field of reeds. Hands severed so they couldn't receive offerings. Tongue cut so they couldn't speak their name before Osiris. It was a spiritual shutdown, a divine foreclosure. And the tools used? Not surgical, not clean. Crude knives, flint shards, hot pokers. In some temple records, priests performed reversal rites rituals that mimicked mummification in reverse. Instead of wrapping the body, they unwrapped it. Instead of preserving it, they spoiled it. Sometimes they salted the corpse not for preservation, but to desiccate it prematurely. The skin shriveled, the face collapsed. The soul, in theory, no longer recognized itself. One of the most extreme forms? The removal of the heart. Not embalmed, not placed in a sacred jar, just ripped out. Why? Because in the afterlife, your heart was weighed against the feather of Mat. Without it, judgment couldn't happen. The soul was trapped, damned by bureaucracy. And if the offender had committed blasphemy, the body was often buried outside the necropolis in unclean ground. No tomb, no marker, no alignment to the sun, just a pit, like garbage. And that's exactly how they were treated. Garbage. The afterlife had paperwork, and corpse mutilation was a divine audit. Some bodies were buried face down, symbolizing shame. Others were folded unnaturally, knees under chin, spine twisted. In one case, a known grave robber's body was found with his own broken tools driven into his skull, symbolic, ironic, final. And this wasn't limited to criminals. If a pharaoh was overthrown, the victor might exhume the predecessor and destroy his mummy. Akhenaten? Possibly mutilated. Hatshepsut? Erased? Even Tutankhamun's tomb bears signs of posthumous political retaliation, though his body was spared. But others weren't so lucky. And sometimes, they were buried in reverse. A ritual inversion. Head at the feet end of the tomb, left facing right, east instead of west. This was cosmic graffiti, a spiritual detour. If the soul rose, it rose the wrong way, forever lost. And let's not forget the ultimate insult, feeding the corpse to animals, jackals, crocodiles, hyenas, sacred creatures in Egyptian mythology. So, to be devoured by them, that was not sanctification. It was sacrilege. One priest, disgraced for falsifying oracles, was said to have been left in the desert tied to a post offered to Anubis for judgment. The vultures came first, and in rare cases, the remains were scattered intentionally across sacred sites, each piece in a different temple, each site reciting the curse simultaneously. Let this soul never gather. Let this name never echo. Let this one be forgotten. Because corpse mutilation wasn't just about punishing the dead. It was about preventing resurrection. You weren't just denied heaven. You were denied existence. And in ancient Egypt, that was the final execution. And now, only one remains. One punishment that was neither physical nor spiritual, but legal and cosmica. Punishment not written in blood, but in scrolls, decrees, and divine bureaucracy. Let's close the circle. Let's end with the curse of legal invisibility, the unpersoned law. Legal invisibility, the unpersoned law. What's worse than death? Worse than exile? Worse than disfigurement, mutilation, or eternal damnation? To never have existed at all. In ancient Egypt, when punishment needed to be surgical and absolute but bloodless, it deployed its most terrifying sentence, legal invisibility. The transformation of a living, breathing person into an administrative ghost. No execution, no whipping, no mutilation. Just absence. This wasn't metaphor, it was procedure. Let's say you committed a crime so politically sensitive, so socially radioactive, that the state couldn't punish you publicly. Maybe you were a royal embarrassment. Maybe you embarrassed a god. Maybe you said something in the wrong year at the wrong time. Execution would make you a martyr. Imprisonment would make you a rumor. So instead, they unwrote you. Here's how it worked. The scribes came first. Your name was removed from all records, tax rolls, temple donations, royal registries, marriage contracts, deeds. You were undocumented, unmarried, unborn. Your cartouches were chiseled off walls. Your statues melted down. Any mention of you on monuments was either removed or replaced with a blank space. Your face became a literal void in history. Next, your belongings. Confiscated, redistributed, reassigned. Your home now housed someone else. Your jewelry now adorned a priest. Your animals were returned to the temple, which usually meant butchered. Then your tomb. If already built, it was sealed, desecrated. Your name scratched out, the amulets removed, the burial chamber collapsed or bricked over, as if to say, this person is not worthy of rest. If you hadn't died yet, you didn't get to plan your afterlife. Because legally, you weren't heading there. Then your family. This was the cruelest part. They were given a choice. Disavow you, or join you. Most chose the former. They changed their names, they forged new lineages, they swore oaths before priests that you were never of their house, a kind of public denial, a severing. Even your children were re-registered, given new guardians, their ties to you erased, their futures rewritten. Some refused, and they vanished too. All of this was written down, but never officially. The process of unpersoning someone required special scrolls, archived in hidden chambers of the temple bureaucracy. These weren't public records, these were state secrets, but they existed. We know because we found them. Half-burned scrolls, cracked tablets, bureaucratic notes referencing names that don't appear anywhere else. People who clearly had power, possessions, influence, and then nothing. Black holes in the paperwork. Some even had their gods revoked. Their names were removed from temple lists of the blessed, their birthdays struck from festival calendars, their deaths not mourned, their souls, if they still existed, no longer welcomed at the gates of the Duat. This was not just erasure. This was legal genocide of one. And it worked. Because Egypt, more than any other civilization, believed in the permanence of the written word. To be named was to be written was to live, to be remembered was to be resurrected. So to be unwritten was to die again and again and again. And here's the final irony. Some of the most powerful, most dangerous people in Egypt are now anonymous. Their punishments survived. Their names didn't. We read about the servant who defiled the rite, the priest who broke the pact, the daughter who betrayed the goddess. But we don't know who they were, because their punishment was perfect. They were legally invisible, spiritually absent, eternally silent. And that, in the end, is the cruelest punishment of all. To walk through history and leave no footsteps.